I was standing in my kitchen, slicing tomatoes for a sandwich I'd never eat, when my phone rang with the kind of sound that makes your blood freeze. You know that feeling, when something in your gut tells you that the world as you know it is about to crack wide open. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was clinical, detached, the kind of tone that people use when they've delivered bad news so many times it doesn't touch them anymore. Mrs. Patterson? This is Detective Lawrence from the Denver Police Department. I'm calling about your son, Daniel Patterson. My hand went to my throat. Daniel. My Danny. My only child. The boy I'd raised alone after his father walked out when he was 3. The man who'd built an empire from nothing, who called me every Sunday without fail, who sent me flowers on my birthday even when he was traveling across the world closing deals worth millions. What about Daniel? I whispered, though part of me already knew. I'm very sorry to inform you that your son was involved in a fatal car accident early this morning. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The tomato I'd been holding slipped from my other hand and hit the floor with a wet thud. Red juice splattered across my white tiles like blood. I remember staring at it, thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could look so violent. The detective kept talking, something about black ice on the highway, losing control, the car rolling multiple times, but his words became a distant hum. All I could hear was my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, demanding that this be a mistake, a cruel joke, anything but the truth. But it was the truth. My Danny was gone at 42 years old, leaving behind a fortune, a business empire, and a family I'd never quite felt part of. Before I go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop a comment and let me know your city or country. I need to know I'm not alone in this darkness. And if you've ever lost someone who meant everything to you, if you've ever felt like the world kept spinning while yours completely stopped, then please, hit that subscribe button. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my story, it's a story about how grief can blind us, how the people we trust can betray us in the worst possible ways, and how sometimes the dead speak louder than the living ever could. Check the description box below for more stories like this, stories of betrayal, survival, and the kind of revenge that changes everything. The funeral was held 6 days later at St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Denver, the same church where Daniel had been christened as a baby. I'd held him in that church, promised God I'd protect him, raise him right, give him everything I never had. And I'd kept that promise. I'd worked 3 jobs to put him through college. I'd sacrificed my own dreams so he could chase his. I'd been there for every scraped knee, every broken heart, every triumph and failure. But as I sat in the front pew that grey November morning, surrounded by hundreds of people who claimed to have loved him, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my 63 years. To my right sat Victoria, Daniel's widow. She was 38, blonde, beautiful in that polished, expensive way that comes from years of spa treatments and personal trainers. She wore a black Chanel dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, and her tears were perfectly timed, falling just enough to smudge her mascara artistically without ruining her makeup. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and I watched her, wondering if any of it was real. Daniel had married her 5 years ago, a whirlwind romance that had happened so fast I'd barely had time to get to know her before she became my daughter-in-law. She'd come from old money, her father owned a chain of luxury hotels across the Southwest, and she'd brought connections that helped Daniel's aviation business expand internationally. I tried to love her, tried to see what Daniel saw in her. But there was always something cold behind her perfect smile, something calculating in the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. Next to Victoria sat her brother, Preston, and their parents, Randolph and Eleanor Ashford. They looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalogue, pressed, proper, and completely composed. Preston kept his hand on Victoria's shoulder in what I suppose was meant to be a comforting gesture, but to me it looked possessive, proprietary. Eleanor wore pearls and an expression of dignified sorrow that seemed more concerned with appearances than genuine grief. I looked around at the sea of faces filling the cathedral. Business associates in expensive suits. Society people who'd attended Daniel's charity galas. Employees from Patterson Aviation, the company Daniel had built from a single charter plane into a fleet of 12 aircraft and a private airport just outside Denver. They all wore the same mask of sadness, but how many of them had actually known my son? How many had listened to him talk about his dreams, his fears, his plans for the future? The service was elegant, expensive, and completely impersonal. The priest who'd never met Daniel read from prepared remarks that could have been about anyone. Victoria had chosen every detail, the flowers, the music, the readings, and none of it felt like Danny. Where were his favorite songs, the classic rock he'd loved since he was a teenager? Where were the stories about his terrible jokes, his obsession with old aviation movies, his habit of calling me at midnight just to tell me about something funny that had happened that day? Instead, we got Mozart and lilies and polite condolences that meant nothing. After the service, everyone filed into the reception hall for coffee and tasteful finger sandwiches that no one really wanted to eat. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting hugs from people whose names I couldn't remember, listening to them tell me how sorry they were while their eyes were already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. That's when Victoria's lawyer approached me. His name was Bernard Whitmore, and he looked exactly like what he was, a shark in a $3,000 suit. He had silver hair slicked back from a face that probably smiled the same whether he was at a wedding or a foreclosure. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, taking my elbow and steering me toward a quiet corner. "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to discuss Daniel's estate. The will reading is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at our offices downtown." I nodded numbly. Of course there was a will. Daniel had been meticulous about business matters. But the thought of sitting in some lawyer's office, dividing up my son's life into assets and percentages, made me feel sick. "Will Victoria be there?" I asked. "Of course. As Daniel's widow, she's the primary beneficiary." Something in the way he said it made my stomach clench. "But you're listed in the will as well, Mrs. Patterson. It's important that you attend." Primary beneficiary. The words echoed in my head as I drove home that evening to my small 2-bedroom house in a quiet suburb 20 miles from Daniel's mansion. I'd moved here 10 years ago when Daniel had insisted on buying me a place outright, getting me out of the cramped apartment where I'd raised him. It was modest but comfortable, and it was mine. Or rather, it had been Daniel's gift to me, paid for with his first big profit from the aviation business. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory I had of my son. Danny as a little boy, bringing me wilted dandelions from the yard and calling them flowers. Danny at 16, getting his first job at a local airport, coming home covered in grease and grinning like he'd found heaven. Danny at 25, showing me the business plan for Patterson Aviation, his eyes bright with dreams I didn't fully understand but supported with everything I had. Danny at 40, calling me from Paris to tell me about the deal he'd just closed, promising to take me to France next time, a promise we'd never get to keep. I thought about Victoria, about the way she'd transformed my son's life. The mansion in Cherry Creek with 8 bedrooms and a view of the mountains. The country club memberships. The charity boards and society events. Daniel had seemed happy, had told me he was happy. But sometimes when he visited me, when it was just the two of us having coffee at my kitchen table, I'd catch a glimpse of something in his eyes. A weariness, maybe, or a longing for simpler times. "Mom," he'd said to me just 3 months ago, "if anything ever happens to me, I need you to know that everything I did for a reason. You taught me to always have a plan, remember?" I'd laughed it off, told him nothing was going to happen to him, that he was too stubborn to die. But he'd taken my hand, squeezed it tight, and looked at me with an intensity that had made me uncomfortable. "I mean it, Mom. Trust the plan. Even if it doesn't make sense at first, trust the plan." At the time, I'd thought he was just being dramatic, maybe stressed about business. Now, lying in the darkness of my bedroom, those words took on a different weight. Trust the plan. What plan? What had my son known that I didn't? I must have finally fallen asleep around dawn, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my curtains and my alarm was blaring. The will reading. I dragged myself out of bed, put on my best black dress, the same one I'd worn to the funeral, and drove downtown with a sense of dread sitting heavy in my chest. Bernard Whitmore's office was on the 20th floor of a glass tower in the financial district. The reception area was all marble and leather, the kind of place designed to intimidate. I gave my name to the receptionist, a young woman with a helmet of hairspray who looked at me with the kind of pity people reserve for the elderly and infirm. Victoria was already there when I was shown into the conference room, sitting at the head of a long mahogany table with her brother Preston beside her. Her parents sat across from them, and there were several other people I didn't recognize, business associates, I assumed, or maybe more lawyers. The Ashford family attorney, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, sat next to Bernard. I took a seat at the far end of the table, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked in this room full of expensive suits and designer handbags. Victoria glanced at me and offered a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. Bernard cleared his throat and opened a leather folder. Thank you all for being here. We're gathered to read the last will and testament of Daniel Marcus Patterson, dated September 15th of this year. 2 months ago. Daniel had updated his will just 2 months before he died. My hands clenched in my lap. Bernard began reading in that formal, detached tone that lawyers use. The legal language washed over me, trusts and estates, percentages and stipulations. But the bottom line became clear quickly enough. To Victoria, the mansion in Cherry Creek, valued at $4.2 million. The entire Patterson Aviation Company, including all aircraft, the private airport, buildings, equipment, and contracts, valued at approximately $20 million. The investment portfolio, valued at another $3 million. The cars, the country club memberships, everything. To Preston Ashford, a position as CEO of Patterson Aviation, with a guaranteed salary and profit-sharing arrangement that would make him a millionaire several times over. To Randolph and Eleanor Ashford, seats on the board of directors, ensuring the company stayed in family hands. I sat there, my mouth dry, my heart pounding, as the list went on and on. Daniel's entire empire, everything he'd built, was being handed over to the Ashford family. Victoria would be one of the wealthiest widows in Denver. Her brother would run the company my son had founded. Her parents would have control over its future. And then Bernard said, to Helen Patricia Patterson, my beloved mother. I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat. I leave the contents of envelope number 7, held in Security Deposit Box 412 at First National Bank of Denver, with instructions that it be opened only by her, in private, with no other parties present. Silence filled the room. I stared at Bernard, waiting for him to continue, to list something else, a house, money, stocks, anything. But he simply reached into his folder and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope with the number 7 written on it in Daniel's handwriting. He slid it across the table toward me. It was sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal. And it was so light, I could tell there was almost nothing inside. Preston laughed, actually laughed. A envelope? Seriously? Victoria's face remained carefully neutral, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Satisfaction? Relief? Eleanor Ashford cleared her throat delicately. Bernard, surely there must be some mistake. Helen raised Daniel alone, sacrificed everything for him. Surely he left her more than an envelope. Bernard shook his head. The will is very clear. Mrs. Patterson receives the contents of envelope number 7. That is all. The room felt like it was tilting. My vision blurred at the edges. Everything, my son had left everything to his wife's family, and for me, the woman who'd given up her life to raise him, he'd left an envelope. I don't remember leaving Bernard's office. Don't remember walking to my car, starting the engine, driving home. The next thing I was fully aware of, I was sitting in my living room, still wearing my coat, staring at the envelope that sat on my coffee table like an accusation. The November afternoon light filtered through my curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The envelope seemed to glow in that light, the red wax seal catching the sun, Daniel's number 7 written in the careful handwriting I'd know anywhere. I'd taught him to write, sitting at our tiny kitchen table when he was 5, his little hand wrapped around a crayon, forming letters with such determination. That little boy had grown into a man who'd left me an envelope. Not money to secure my retirement. Not a share of the business I'd encouraged him to build. Not even a small token of the love I'd thought we shared. Just an envelope. My phone had been ringing non-stop since I got home. Friends from church, wanting to know if I was okay. My cousin Dorothy from Phoenix, asking about the funeral. I'd ignored them all. I couldn't bear to tell anyone what had happened at the will reading. Couldn't bear to say out loud that my son had essentially erased me from his legacy. The cruelest part wasn't even the money, though God knows I could have used it. I was living on Social Security and a tiny pension from the factory where I'd worked for 30 years. The house was paid off, thank God, but everything else was tight. I clipped coupons, bought generic brands, wore clothes until they literally fell apart. I'd been proud of my frugality, had told myself I didn't need Daniel's money because I'd raised him to be independent, to make his own way. But this felt like rejection. Like everything I'd done, all the sacrifices, all the years of putting him first, all the love I'd poured into him, had been weighed and found wanting. The phone rang again. This time I looked at the screen. Victoria. My finger hovered over the decline button. But something made me answer. Helen. Her voice was soft, gentle, the same tone you'd use with a child or a frightened animal. I wanted to check on you. I know today must have been difficult. Difficult. What a pale word for the devastation I felt. I'm fine, I managed to say. I want you to know that I tried to talk Daniel out of the will arrangement, Victoria continued. I could hear ice clinking in a glass on her end. She was having a drink. In the middle of the afternoon. In her $4 million house that used to be my son's. I told him he should provide better for you. But he was so stubborn, Helen. Once he'd made up his mind about something. Yes, I whispered. He was stubborn. Got that from me. The offer still stands, Victoria said. I know you don't want charity, but the house in Cherry Creek has a guest cottage. You could move in, have your own space. I wouldn't feel right, living in this big place alone while you're... She trailed off delicately. While I'm what? Poor? Alone? Abandoned by my own son? That's kind of you, I said, my voice flat. But I'm fine where I am. Well, the offer's always open. And Helen? Whatever's in that envelope, I'm sure Daniel had his reasons. He loved you so much. He talked about you all the time. Did he? Because the man who loved me so much had just given his entire fortune to his wife's family while leaving me with less than a stranger might get in a will. After I hung up, I sat there for another hour, just staring at the envelope. The sun moved across the sky, the shadows in my living room shifted, and still I couldn't bring myself to open it. What if it was empty? What if this was Daniel's way of telling me I meant nothing to him? Or worse, what if there was a letter inside explaining why he'd cut me out, listing all the ways I'd failed him as a mother? My mind spiraled through possibilities, each one worse than the last. By the time I finally picked up the envelope, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely break the wax seal. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once. And a plane ticket. I pulled out the ticket first. It was a first-class ticket on Emirates Airlines, departing from Denver International Airport in 3 days, arriving in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. The ticket was non-refundable, non-transferable, open-ended return. And it was in my name. Just a plane ticket. My son had left me a plane ticket. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. There was only one sentence, written in Daniel's handwriting, Mom, trust the plan. It starts in Dubai. I love you more than you know. Trust the plan. The same words he'd said to me 3 months ago. But what plan? What could possibly be in Dubai? I read the note over and over, searching for hidden meaning, for some clue about what my son had been thinking. But there was nothing else. Just those few words and a plane ticket to a city I'd never been to, had never even thought about visiting. The next morning, I called the airline to see if I could exchange the ticket for something more practical. Cash, a voucher, anything. But the agent told me the ticket was completely non-transferable and couldn't be refunded. It was use it or lose it. I spent the next 2 days in a fog, trying to decide what to do. My rational mind said to forget about it, to let the ticket go unused. What was I supposed to do in Dubai? I was a 63-year-old widow with no travel experience, no sense of adventure. The farthest I'd ever been from Colorado was California, and that was for a work conference 20 years ago. But Daniel's words kept echoing in my head. Trust the plan. As if there was some grand design I couldn't see yet, some purpose to this bizarre inheritance. On the morning of the flight, I woke up at 4 a.m. and made a decision. I was going to Dubai. Not because I understood what Daniel wanted, but because it was the last thing my son had asked of me. And maybe, just maybe, there would be answers there. I packed a single suitcase with practical clothes, called my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez to water my plants, and drove to the airport in the pre-dawn darkness. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. Who was this woman going through security, boarding an international flight to a country she knew nothing about? It couldn't be me. I didn't do things like this. The first-class cabin was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The seat was bigger than my recliner at home, and it reclined all the way into a bed. The flight attendants called me Mrs. Patterson and offered me champagne before we even took off. I asked for water instead, too nervous to drink alcohol. During the 14-hour flight, I had plenty of time to think. To replay the will reading, to imagine Victoria settling into the mansion, Preston taking over Daniel's office at Patterson Aviation. To wonder what the hell I was doing on a plane to Dubai. The other passengers in first class all looked wealthy, comfortable, like international travel was routine for them. Businessmen in expensive suits worked on laptops. A couple in their 40s spoke to each other in what sounded like Arabic. A younger woman scrolled through her phone, her fingers heavy with diamonds. And then there was me, in my 10-year-old dress from JCPenney, clutching a purse I'd bought at Target, flying to Dubai because my dead son had left me a plane ticket instead of an inheritance. If you're still watching, I want you to do me a favor. Think about the last time someone you trusted completely let you down. Think about that moment when you realized everything you believed was wrong. Hit that subscribe button if you know what I'm talking about, because this story is about to take a turn I never saw coming. And check the description box below, there are more stories there about betrayal, about the truth hiding behind closed doors, about how the people we love can hurt us in ways we never imagined. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, the captain was announcing our descent into Dubai. I looked out the window and saw a city rising out of the desert, all glass and steel, impossibly tall buildings gleaming in the morning sun. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, nothing like the Denver skyline I knew. The airport was massive, overwhelming, filled with people from every corner of the world. I followed the signs to immigration, showed my passport, was waved through with barely a glance. And then I was in the arrivals hall, surrounded by people holding signs with names on them, families reuniting, businessmen striding purposefully toward waiting cars. I stood there, lost, holding my single suitcase, wondering what I was supposed to do next. The letter had said it starts in Dubai, but what was it? Was I supposed to go to a specific hotel? Wait for someone to contact me? My son had left me no instructions beyond the plane ticket. I was about to find a tourist information desk when I saw him. A man in a black suit and chauffeur's cap, holding a sign that said Helen Patterson in bold letters. My heart started pounding. I walked toward him slowly, half expecting him to lower the sign and tell me there'd been a mistake. But when I reached him, he smiled warmly and said, "Mrs. Patterson, welcome to Dubai. I've been waiting for you." He was Middle Eastern, maybe in his 50s, with kind eyes and a weathered face. He took my suitcase before I could protest and gestured toward the exit. "Please, follow me. We have a car waiting." "Wait," I said, my voice shaky. "Who sent you? How did you know I was coming?" "All will be explained, Mrs. Patterson. But first, let's get you somewhere comfortable. You must be exhausted from your flight." I should have been scared. I should have refused to go with a stranger in a foreign country. But something in his manner, in the gentle patience of his expression, made me trust him. Or maybe I was just too tired and confused to argue. He led me to a black Mercedes parked in a VIP area. The interior was cool, the leather seats soft. As we pulled away from the airport, I watched the city unfold around me. Massive highways, stunning architecture, the kind of wealth on display that made Denver look like a small town. "Where are we going?" I asked. The driver met my eyes in the rearview mirror. And then he said 5 words that changed everything, 5 words that made my jaw drop and my world shift on its axis. "To see your son's secret." For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't process what the driver had just said. "My son's secret." I finally managed to whisper, "What are you talking about? Daniel is dead." The driver's eyes in the rearview mirror were sympathetic but firm. "I understand this is confusing, Mrs. Patterson. But Mr. Daniel wanted you to see everything before anyone explained anything. He said you deserved to understand the full picture. We're going to Burj Khalifa first. There's someone waiting for you there." Burj Khalifa. Even I knew that name, the tallest building in the world, an iconic spire that dominated the Dubai skyline. I could see it now through the car window, impossibly tall, piercing the blue sky like a needle. But why would Daniel have anything to do with a place like that? He'd never mentioned Dubai in all our conversations. Had he? I tried to remember. Had there been trips I didn't know about? Business deals he'd kept from me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I'd actually known about the details of Daniel's business in the last few years. He'd stopped talking about specific deals, specific flights. I'd assumed it was because I wouldn't understand the complexity. Now I wondered if there had been another reason. The drive from the airport took about 20 minutes. We passed shopping malls that looked like palaces, hotels that gleamed like jewels, construction sites where new impossible buildings were rising from the sand. Everything was bigger, bolder, more audacious than anything I'd ever seen. The wealth on display was almost obscene, especially to someone like me who'd spent 50 years counting pennies. The Mercedes pulled up to a grand entrance at the base of Burj Khalifa. The driver came around to open my door, but I sat there, frozen. Part of me wanted to demand answers before going any further. But another part of me, the part that had raised Daniel to be brave, to face challenges head-on, made me take the driver's offered hand and step out of the car. "Just take the elevator to the 148th floor, he said, handing me my purse but keeping my suitcase. "Don't worry about your luggage. I'll make sure it gets where it needs to go. Someone named Rashid will be waiting for you." Before I could ask anything else, he was back in the car and driving away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk in a foreign country with no phone that worked internationally, no local currency, and no idea what was happening. An attendant in an immaculate uniform approached me. "Mrs. Patterson, please, follow me." Apparently, everyone in Dubai knew I was coming except me. I followed him through a magnificent lobby, all marble and gold, to a special elevator. He used a key card to access it, then pressed the button for the 148th floor. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished metal, a tired old woman with grey hair, wearing a dress that looked cheap under these bright lights, completely out of place in this temple of wealth and power. The elevator was so fast I felt my stomach drop. Numbers climbed on the digital display: 50, 75, 100, 125. Through the glass walls, I could see Dubai spreading out below me, becoming smaller and smaller until it looked like a toy city. When the doors opened on the 148th floor, I stepped out into a viewing area that took my breath away. The entire city was laid out below, the Persian Gulf glittering in the distance, the desert stretching beyond. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, this God's eye view of the world. "Mrs. Patterson." I turned to see a man approaching. He was maybe 40, wearing a pristine white thobe and a red-checked gutra held in place with a black eagle. His face was kind, his eyes serious. "I'm Rashid Al Maktoum," he said, extending his hand. "I was your son's business partner." I shook his hand automatically, my mind reeling. "Business partner? I don't understand." Daniel's business was Patterson Aviation. In Denver. Rashid smiled gently. "That's what everyone thought. Please, sit down. This is going to take some time to explain." He led me to a private seating area, away from the tourists taking photos of the view. A server appeared with tea and small pastries that I couldn't have eaten if my life depended on it. "Mrs. Patterson," Rashid began, "your son was a brilliant man. But he was also very careful, very strategic. What I'm about to tell you, he kept secret from everyone except me and 2 other people. Not even his wife knew." My mouth went dry. Knew what? 5 years ago, Daniel came to Dubai for what he told everyone was a vacation. But he was really here to explore business opportunities. He'd done his research and realized that Dubai was becoming a major hub for private aviation in the Middle East. Wealthy clients from all over the region needed reliable, luxurious private jet services. I nodded slowly, trying to follow. Daniel approached me with a proposal. He wanted to create a second company, completely separate from Patterson Aviation in Denver. A Dubai-based luxury charter service that would cater to the ultra-wealthy in the region. We would be 50-50 partners. He would provide the aviation expertise and initial capital. I would provide local knowledge, connections, and help navigate the business environment here. "I don't understand," I said. "Why keep it secret?" Rashid's expression darkened. "Because your son didn't trust his wife." The words hung in the air between us. I wanted to defend Victoria, to say that Daniel had loved her, that surely Rashid was mistaken. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I'd never trusted her either. Daniel discovered, about 6 months after his marriage, that Victoria had married him primarily for his wealth and business connections, Rashid continued. He found emails between her and her brother Preston, discussing how to gradually take control of Patterson Aviation. They had a plan to push Daniel out of the company he'd built, to restructure it under Preston's management while keeping Daniel as a figurehead. I felt sick. And Daniel knew this for 4.5 years. Why didn't he divorce her? Because he was playing a longer game, Mrs. Patterson. If he'd divorced her, she would have been entitled to half of everything in the divorce settlement. Colorado is a no-fault divorce state. She would have walked away with tens of millions and likely would have caused massive damage to his business reputation in the process. The Ashford family has significant influence in Denver's business community. So he stayed married to a woman he didn't trust. The thought broke my heart. He stayed married, but he protected himself. And he protected you. Rashid pulled out a tablet and showed me a photo. It was a sleek, modern building near what looked like an airport. This is Diamond Sky Aviation. Daniel and I built it together. We have a fleet of 8 aircraft, all top of the line. We serve clients from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, and across the Middle East. Our revenue last year was $18 million. I stared at the photo, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Daniel built a second company, here in Dubai. Not just a company, Mrs. Patterson. An empire. One that Victoria and her family knew nothing about. One that was held in a complex network of trusts and international corporate structures that kept it completely separate from anything in the United States. Untouchable by American divorce law or probate courts. My head was spinning. But why? Why do all this? Because your son learned early in his marriage that the Ashford family was dangerous. They didn't just want his money. They wanted his company, his reputation, his entire legacy. And they were patient about it. Preston had been positioning himself as Daniel's right-hand man for years, learning the business, building relationships with Daniel's employees and clients. The plan was to eventually push Daniel into early retirement, claiming he was burned out or wanted to focus on other things, and install Preston as CEO with Victoria controlling the shares. My God, I whispered. Daniel could have fought them. But he chose a different path. He chose to build something they couldn't touch, something that would secure both his legacy and your future. And then... Rashid paused, his face grave. And then he updated his American will, making it look like he'd left everything to Victoria and her family. The will reading, I said, understanding dawning. Everyone thought he'd shut me out completely. Everyone thought exactly what he wanted them to think. Victoria and her family believe they've won. They have the mansion, the American company, the airport in Denver. And they're welcome to it, Mrs. Patterson. Because it's all that's left. I frowned. What do you mean, all that's left? Rashid smiled, and there was something almost triumphant in his expression. 6 months ago, Daniel began quietly selling off assets from Patterson Aviation. Not the planes or the physical property, those would be too obvious. But the valuable contracts, the international routes, the landing rights at major airports, the maintenance agreements with other private aviation companies. Everything that actually generated significant profit. He sold them through intermediary companies, making it look like normal business decisions, and he moved the money here, to Dubai. My breath caught. How much money? Approximately $32 million. The room spun. I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. Patterson Aviation still exists, Rashid continued. But it's essentially a shell. The physical assets are worth maybe $5 million. The ongoing business, without those contracts and rights, will generate only a fraction of what it once did. Victoria and Preston will spend years trying to rebuild what they think they have, only to discover they've inherited a beautiful house of cards. But that's... I struggled to find words. That's fraud, isn't it? That's illegal. It's brilliant business strategy, Rashid corrected. Daniel was the sole owner and CEO of Patterson Aviation. He had every right to sell assets and restructure the business as he saw fit. Nothing he did was illegal. Unethical to his wife, perhaps, but not illegal. And given that she was planning to take everything from him anyway, I'd say it was justified. I sat there, trying to process it all. My son, my Danny, had spent years planning this elaborate scheme. He'd built a secret empire, moved millions of dollars across the world, all while pretending to be the devoted husband and successful businessman everyone thought he was. The car accident, I said suddenly. Was it really an accident? Rashid's face softened. Yes, Mrs. Patterson. That was real. Daniel was driving back from a meeting in the mountains. There really was black ice. It was terrible timing. He'd just finalized everything, was about to bring you here to explain it all. Instead, he died, and I had to figure it out myself. I felt tears burning in my eyes. He must have been so alone, Rashid. Living with a woman he didn't trust, building all this in secret, carrying the weight of it all by himself. Rashid reached across and patted my hand gently. He wasn't alone, Mrs. Patterson. He had me. And he had his plans for you. That's why you're here. Daniel made me promise that if anything happened to him before he could tell you himself, I would bring you here and show you everything. And then I would give you something. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope, much heavier than the one I'd received at the will reading. This one was sealed with multiple wax stamps and had my name written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. Before you open that, Rashid said, I need to explain the rest. Diamond Sky Aviation is 50% mine and 50% yours. Daniel transferred his shares into a trust with you as the sole beneficiary. The trust was established under UAE law, completely protected from American probate courts. Victoria can't touch it. Preston can't touch it. It's yours, free and clear. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. 50% of an $18 million company? The company generates approximately $9 million in profit annually, Rashid continued. Your share would be $4.5 million per year. But that's just the beginning. Daniel also transferred the money from the Patterson Aviation asset sales into an investment portfolio held here in Dubai. That $32 million, plus the returns it's generated over the past 6 months, now totals about $34 million. That's also held in trust for you. I felt like I was going to pass out. This couldn't be real. People like me didn't have millions of dollars. We clipped coupons and wore hammer-downs and worried about the electric bill. There's more, Rashid said. Daniel purchased a villa for you here in Dubai. It's in the Palm Jumeirah, one of the most exclusive areas in the city. 3 bedrooms, ocean view, fully furnished. The deed is in your name. He also established accounts for you at several local banks, set up a pension that will pay you $50,000 per month for life, and hired a financial advisory team to help you manage everything. My vision was blurring with tears. I don't understand. Why would he do all this? Because you're his mother, Rashid said simply. Because you sacrificed everything for him, and he wanted to make sure you would never have to worry about anything again. He told me once that the hardest part of all this planning wasn't outsmarting Victoria and her family. It was knowing that for a while, you would think he'd abandoned you. That moment at the will reading, when they laughed as you opened that envelope, he knew that would hurt you. But he also knew it was necessary to make them believe they'd won. The will reading. Victoria and her family, so smug, so satisfied. Preston laughing at the envelope. Bernard Whitmore's barely concealed pity. They'd all thought Daniel had betrayed me. And for a few days, so had I. He left you a letter, Rashid said, handing me the thick envelope. He wrote it 6 months ago, when he started putting everything in motion. He updated it every few weeks. The last entry is from 2 days before he died. My hands trembled as I broke the seals and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, all covered in Daniel's handwriting. The first page was dated 6 months earlier. Mom, it began, and just seeing that word in his handwriting made tears spill down my cheeks. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've made it to Dubai. I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused you. I'm sorry for the will reading, sorry for making you think, even for a moment, that I didn't love you. But I need you to understand why I did things this way. I couldn't read anymore, not here, not with Rashid watching. I looked up at him through my tears. Can I? Is there somewhere I can be alone? Of course. Let me take you to your villa. You can read everything there, and we'll talk more when you're ready. But Mrs. Patterson, there's one more thing you need to know before we leave here. I waited, not sure I could handle any more revelations. Daniel's death is being investigated as an accident, Rashid said carefully. But I'm not entirely convinced it was. The police reports say he lost control on black ice. But Daniel was an experienced driver, familiar with that mountain road. And the night he died, he'd called me, sounding worried. He said something about Victoria acting strange, asking too many questions about his business travel. He thought maybe she'd started to suspect something. Ice ran through my veins. You think Victoria had something to do with his death? I think we should be very careful, Rashid said. I think we should make sure that Victoria and her family continue to believe they've gotten everything they wanted. And I think we should wait, and watch, and see what they do next. My grief was suddenly shot through with something else. Something cold and sharp. If Victoria had killed my son, my Danny, then she was going to pay for it. Not just lose money, but pay in every way that mattered. What are you saying? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. I'm saying that Diamond Sky Aviation needs an active partner, Mrs. Patterson. I'm saying that you now have the resources to do whatever you need to do. And I'm saying that I promised your son I would help you, in any way you needed, for as long as you needed it. We looked at each other across that table, high above Dubai, and something passed between us. An understanding. An alliance. Take me to the villa, I said. I need to read my son's letter. And then we're going to figure out exactly what happened on that mountain road. I need you to pause for just a second and think about this. Have you ever discovered that everything you thought you knew was wrong? That the people you trusted were lying, and the person you thought had betrayed you actually loved you more than you ever imagined? If this story is hitting you where it hurts, if you're feeling the weight of these revelations the way I felt them, then please subscribe. Because we're only getting started. Check the description box below for more stories about betrayal, revenge, and the kind of justice that comes when you least expect it. The drive to Palm Jumeirah took another 30 minutes. Rashid explained that it was a man-made island shaped like a palm tree, extending into the Persian Gulf. As we drove onto the island, I saw luxury hotels, mansions that made Daniel's Cherry Creek house look modest, and beaches with sand so white it looked like snow. The villa Rashid pulled up to was beautiful, white stone, modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean. It was gated and private, with a small garden full of flowering plants I didn't recognize. The staff has been expecting you, Rashid said, unlocking the front door. There's a housekeeper who comes 3 times a week, and a chef available if you want meals prepared. But the space is yours, to do with as you please. Inside, the villa was stunning. Open, airy, decorated in whites and blues that echoed the ocean outside. The kitchen was state-of-the-art. The living room had comfortable furniture and that same breathtaking view. Rashid showed me the bedrooms, one clearly designated as mine, with my suitcase already placed at the foot of a king-sized bed. I'll leave you now, Rashid said. My card is on the kitchen counter. Call me anytime, day or night. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I'll take you to see Diamond Sky Aviation. You should see what your son built. What you now own. After he left, I stood in the center of the living room, feeling like I'd walked into someone else's life. This couldn't be mine. This villa, this wealth, this incredible view. I was Helen Patterson from Denver, Colorado. I'd worked in a factory. I shopped at Walmart. I didn't belong in places like this. But Daniel had thought I did. Daniel had built all this for me. I took my son's letter out to the terrace, sat in a cushioned chair facing the ocean, and began to read. The letter was long, detailed, and heartbreaking. Daniel explained everything Rashid had told me, but in his own words, with his own emotions laid bare. He wrote about the moment he'd discovered Victoria's betrayal, finding emails she'd carelessly left open on a computer at home. How he'd felt like his heart had been ripped out, but how he'd forced himself to think strategically instead of emotionally. He wrote about building Diamond Sky Aviation, about the thrill of creating something in secret, something pure that wasn't tainted by the Ashford family's greed. About choosing Rashid as a partner because he was honest, honorable, someone Daniel could trust completely in a world where trust had become a rare commodity. He wrote about the guilt he felt, living in that mansion with Victoria, pretending everything was fine while knowing she was plotting against him. About the nights he'd lie awake, thinking about me, wishing he could tell me everything but knowing that any contact that seemed unusual might tip her off. The hardest part, Mom, he wrote in an entry from 3 months before his death, is knowing that when this all comes out, you're going to have to go through pain first. You're going to sit in that lawyer's office and think I betrayed you. You're going to cry, maybe hate me for a while. And I won't be there to explain, to hold you, to tell you that everything I did was for you. That thought keeps me up at night. But I'm gambling that you'll follow the breadcrumbs. That you'll get on that plane to Dubai. That you'll trust me one more time, even when it doesn't make sense. Because that's what you taught me, Mom, to have faith even when you can't see the path ahead. I was sobbing by this point, tears streaming down my face, dropping onto the pages. The final entry, written 2 days before he died, was shorter. Tomorrow I'm driving to Boulder for a meeting with some investors. Victoria has been acting strange lately, asking about my travel schedule, about business details she's never cared about before. Preston has been making comments about the company's direction, trying to get me to agree to changes that would give him more control. I think they're getting impatient, maybe planning to make their move sooner than I expected. But it's okay. Everything is in place. Everything is protected. You're protected. If something happens to me, Rashid knows what to do. And Mom, I love you. I'm sorry for any pain I've caused. I'm sorry I couldn't be a better son. But know this, every decision I made thinking about you. I sat on that terrace as the sun set over the Persian Gulf, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I let myself cry. Not just for Daniel's death, but for the years he'd spent living a lie. For the loneliness he must have felt. For the fact that his last days had been spent worried and suspicious, unable to even trust his own wife. And I cried for myself, for the days I'd spent thinking my son had abandoned me, feeling betrayed and worthless and forgotten. But beneath the grief, something else was growing. Something hard and sharp and unforgiving. Victoria. Preston. The whole Ashford family. They'd taken my son from me. Maybe not directly. Maybe the accident really was an accident. But they'd stolen years of his life, forcing him to live in suspicion and fear. They'd made his last years a performance instead of a life. And they'd laughed at me. At that wall reading, when I'd opened that envelope, Preston had laughed like it was all a joke. Like I was pathetic, worthless, deserving of nothing. They thought they'd won. Thought they had Daniel's entire empire. They had no idea what was coming. I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through sheer curtains and the sound of waves lapping against the shore. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then it all came rushing back. Dubai, the letter, Daniel's secret empire, the villa that was somehow mine. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the life I'd lived for 63 years with the one I'd apparently inherited. How did a person go from clipping coupons to owning a multimillion-dollar villa? From worrying about the electric bill to having $4.5 million in annual income? It didn't feel real. None of it felt real. My phone, which Daniel had apparently arranged to have international service activated, buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Rashid. Good morning. I'll pick you up at 10 a.m. to show you Diamond Sky Aviation, if you're feeling up to it. Take your time. There's no rush. I looked at the clock. It was 8:30. I pulled myself out of bed and explored the villa in the morning light. The kitchen was stocked with food, fresh fruit, bread, eggs, things I could actually cook. I made myself coffee using a machine that probably cost more than my monthly social security check and took it out to the terrace. The ocean was impossibly blue, glittering in the morning sun. A few people were walking on the beach below, and in the distance, I could see the sails of boats catching the wind. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Daniel should have been here to see this. Should have been here to show me around, to tell me about his business, to finally be honest about everything. Instead, I was alone in paradise, surrounded by wealth I didn't understand, trying to figure out how to honor my son's memory and protect the legacy he'd died to build. I texted Rashid back, I'll be ready. At exactly 10 o'clock, a black Mercedes pulled up outside the villa. But it wasn't Rashid who got out. It was a woman, maybe in her early 30s, wearing a sharp business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She was Middle Eastern, with intelligent eyes and a confident stride. Mrs. Patterson, she said when I opened the door. I'm Layla Hassan. I'm the CFO of Diamond Sky Aviation. Rashid asked me to bring you to the office this morning. He's dealing with a client situation but will join us shortly. Oh, I said, suddenly self-conscious about my simple cotton dress and comfortable shoes. Next to her polished elegance, I looked like exactly what I was, an old woman out of her depth. But if Layla thought anything about my appearance, she didn't show it. She simply smiled warmly and held open the car door for me. During the 20-minute drive, Layla gave me a crash course in Diamond Sky Aviation's operations. They had 8 aircraft, ranging from smaller jets that seated 6 passengers to a larger one that could accommodate 14. They employed 32 people, including pilots, flight attendants, maintenance crew, and administrative staff. Their primary clients were wealthy families and business executives from across the Middle East. Mr. Daniel was very particular about who we accepted as clients, Layla explained. We turned down business regularly. He wanted Diamond Sky to have a reputation for exclusivity and excellence, not just for anyone with money. That approach has served us well. Our clients are loyal, discreet, and willing to pay premium prices. And you knew Daniel well? I asked. Very well. He hired me 3 years ago, brought me over from another aviation company. He was a brilliant businessman, Mrs. Patterson. Demanding, but fair. He expected excellence but was willing to invest in people to help them achieve it. When he died. She paused, her voice catching slightly. We were all devastated. He'd become more than just our employer. He was someone we respected, admired. It was strange, hearing people talk about this version of Daniel that I'd never really known. The international businessman, the secret empire builder, the man who commanded respect in boardrooms in Dubai. I'd only ever known him as my Danny, the boy who'd brought me wilted flowers and called me every Sunday. Diamond Sky Aviation's offices were located at Al Maktoum International Airport, Dubai's secondary airport that served primarily cargo and charter flights. The building was modern, sleek, all glass and steel with the company logo, a stylized diamond with wings, prominently displayed. Layla led me inside, and immediately, I felt the weight of everyone's stares. Employees looked up from their desks, conversation stopped, and I realized they all knew who I was. Rashid must have told them I was coming. A young man approached, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me of Daniel when he was young. Mrs. Patterson. Welcome. I'm James, I'm one of the pilots. Mr. Daniel trained me himself. I just want to say, your son was an incredible man. He changed my life. Others came forward then, introducing themselves, sharing brief memories of Daniel. Fatima, the operations manager, who said Daniel had helped her get promoted when other aviation companies had overlooked her because she was a woman. Marcus, wait, no, I catch myself. David, a maintenance chief, who said Daniel had paid for his daughter's medical treatment when insurance wouldn't cover it. Sarah, no, I mean Jasmine, a flight attendant, who said Daniel had given her a bonus to help her family back home in the Philippines. These stories, these people, they all painted a picture of my son that made my heart swell with pride and break with grief at the same time. This was Daniel's real legacy. Not the mansion in Cherry Creek or the shell company Victoria had inherited, but this place, these people, the lives he'd touched. Layla took me to a large office on the second floor. The nameplate on the door said Daniel Patterson, CEO. Inside, everything was neat, organized, exactly as he must have left it the last time he was here. There were photos on the desk, several of me, from different times in his life. Me holding him as a baby. Me at his college graduation. Me at his 30th birthday party, laughing at something he'd said. But there were no photos of Victoria. Not a single one. This is your office now, if you want it, Layla said softly. Or we can convert it to something else. Whatever you're comfortable with. I ran my hand over the desk, imagining Daniel sitting here, running his secret empire, building something beautiful while his marriage crumbled around him. Leave it for now, I said. I'm not ready to change anything yet. Of course. Let me show you the financial reports. We spent the next 2 hours going over spreadsheets, profit and loss statements, client contracts, and operational expenses. Layla was patient, explaining everything in terms I could understand. The picture that emerged was of a company that was not just profitable, but growing. Daniel and Rashid had built something sustainable, something with real value beyond just the immediate revenue. The question now, Layla said, is what you want to do going forward. Rashid can run the operations side, he's excellent at client relations and business development. I can handle the finances. But we need strategic direction. We need someone to make the big decisions about where the company goes from here. I don't know anything about running an aviation company, I said. You don't need to know about aviation. You need to know about people, about values, about what kind of legacy you want to build. Mr. Daniel always said that business success wasn't about knowing everything, it was about asking the right questions and surrounding yourself with good people who could help you find the answers. Before I could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Rashid entered, looking apologetic. Mrs. Patterson, I'm sorry I'm late. Client emergency. We had a prince who needed last-minute travel to London. All settled now. He glanced at Layla. Has she seen the hangar yet? Not yet. I was just about to take her. Perfect. Come on, Mrs. Patterson. Let me show you the fleet. The hangar was enormous, and inside it sat 8 of the most beautiful aircraft I'd ever seen. They gleamed under the bright lights, each one perfect, pristine. Rashid walked me through them one by one, explaining the specs, the capabilities, the modifications Daniel had insisted on to make them the best in the business. This one, he said, stopping in front of a sleek white jet with gold accents, was Daniel's favorite. He called it the Helen. He was planning to surprise you with it, was going to bring you here and show you that he'd named his best plane after his best girl. I felt tears spring to my eyes. He was going to name a plane after me. More than that. Look at the tail. I walked around to the back of the aircraft. There, painted in elegant script next to the Diamond Sky logo, was Helen's dream. He had it painted 6 months ago, Rashid said. Said it was a reminder of why he was building all this. Because you dreamed of a better life for him, and he wanted to dream of a better life for you. I couldn't hold it together anymore. I stood there in that hangar, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of aircraft, and sobbed. For my son, for his kindness, for the fact that even in the midst of betrayal and secrecy, he'd been thinking of me, naming planes after me, building a legacy for me. Rashid put a gentle hand on my shoulder and waited until I'd cried myself out. I'm sorry, I finally said, wiping my eyes with a tissue he'd handed me. Don't be. Daniel would have understood. He loved you very much, Mrs. Patterson. Everything you see here, it's all because of that love. We stood there in silence for a moment, and then I made a decision. I want to be involved, I said. I don't know how yet, and I'm going to need a lot of help. But this was Daniel's dream, and I'm not going to let it disappear or be sold off or fade away. I'm going to learn this business. I'm going to be worthy of what he built. Rashid smiled. He knew you'd say that. He told me, my mom never backs down from a challenge. If I know her, she'll turn Diamond Sky into something even bigger than I imagined. There's something else I want, I said, my voice hardening. I want to know for certain what happened to Daniel. You said you weren't sure the accident was really an accident. I need to know the truth. And I need to know everything about Victoria and her family, everything Daniel knew, everything he suspected, everything that made him distrust them. Rashid's expression turned serious. I was hoping you'd say that too. Because I've been doing some digging, Mrs. Patterson. And I've found some things that are very interesting. Very suspicious. Things I think you need to see. We went back to his office, smaller and more functional than Daniel's had been. He pulled out a file folder, thick with papers and photos. Remember I told you Daniel called me the night he died, said Victoria was acting strange. Rashid began. Well, I asked a friend in the Denver Police Department to look into the accident investigation. Unofficially. Quietly. And there are some inconsistencies. He spread out photos from the accident scene. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see the twisted metal that had been Daniel's car, but I forced myself. This was important. The police report says Daniel lost control on black ice, Rashid continued. But the weather reports show that while it was cold that night, there'd been no precipitation in that area for 3 days. There shouldn't have been ice on that particular stretch of road. My heart started pounding. So what caused the accident? The brake lines had ruptured. The police assumed it was from the impact, from the crash itself. But my friend looked at the photos more carefully. The rupture point looks wrong, too clean, too specific. He thinks the lines might have been partially cut beforehand, so they would fail under hard braking. Someone tampered with his brakes. The words felt unreal coming out of my mouth. It's possible. But here's where it gets interesting. 2 days before Daniel died, his car was serviced at the dealership. Standard maintenance, oil change, that sort of thing. But the service was arranged by Victoria, not Daniel. She called the dealership, said Daniel was too busy, asked them to pick up the car from the house and bring it back when they were done. The implication hung in the air between us. Victoria had arranged for Daniel's car to be taken away. Anything could have been done to it during that time. That's not proof, I said, though my voice shook. No, Rashid agreed. It's not proof. But there's more. Preston Ashford was asking questions about Diamond Sky Aviation 3 weeks before Daniel died. I jerked my head up. How? This company was secret. How would Preston even know it existed? That's what I want to figure out. Someone told him something. Maybe not everything, but enough to make him curious. And when Preston gets curious about money, bad things tend to happen. Rashid pulled out more papers, financial records, emails, corporate filings. I've been researching the Ashford family business empire. Did you know that Randolph Ashford, Victoria's father, has had 3 business partners over the years? And did you know that all 3 of those partnerships ended with the partners mysteriously dying or disappearing, and their shares somehow ending up in Randolph's hands. A chill ran down my spine. What are you saying? I'm saying the Ashford family has a pattern. They identify successful business people, make connections with them, become trusted allies. And then, when it's most profitable, those people meet with unfortunate accidents. Nothing provable, nothing the police ever pursue seriously, but the pattern is there if you know where to look. My God, I whispered. Daniel married into a family of killers. I don't have proof of that, but I have suspicions. Strong suspicions. And I think Daniel started to have those same suspicions in the months before he died. That's why he accelerated his plans, moved money faster than we'd originally discussed. He was afraid he was running out of time. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. If Victoria and her family had killed Daniel, had murdered my son for his money, then they were going to pay. Not just financially. Not just by losing the empire they thought they'd stolen. They were going to pay in every way possible. What can we do? I asked. Can we prove any of this? Not yet. But Mrs. Patterson, you have something they don't know about. You have resources. You have this company, these people, this wealth. You have the element of surprise. As far as the Ashford family knows, you're just a poor old woman living on Social Security, devastated by your son's death, left with nothing. They think you're powerless. So we let them keep thinking that, I said slowly. We let them believe they've won. And while they're celebrating, we investigate. We find proof. And when we have everything we need, we destroy them, Rashid finished. Not just financially, though that's part of it. We destroy their reputation, their business, their standing in the community. We make sure everyone knows what kind of people they really are. We looked at each other across that desk, and I felt something click into place. A purpose. A mission. Daniel had spent the last years of his life protecting his legacy and planning for my future. Now it was my turn to protect his memory and make sure his death meant something. Where do we start? I asked. Rashid smiled. We start by having you stay here in Dubai for a while, learning the business, getting to know the team. You need to understand Diamond Sky inside and out. Meanwhile, I have contacts in Denver, investigators, lawyers, people who can dig into the Ashford family's past quietly. We build our case slowly, carefully. We don't make a move until we're absolutely certain we can win. How long will that take? Months, maybe longer. Can you be patient, Mrs. Patterson? Can you sit on this anger and grief and use it as fuel instead of letting it burn you up? I thought about Daniel, about the years he'd spent playing the long game, living with Victoria while knowing what she was planning. If he could do that, I could do this. I can be patient, I said. But Rashid? When the time comes, I want to be the one to tell them. I want to see their faces when they realize that everything they thought they'd stolen was worthless, and that the old woman they laughed at is the one who actually inherited my son's empire. That, Rashid said, can definitely be arranged. Before you move on, I need to tell you something. This story gets darker from here. It gets more twisted, more complicated. If you want to see how a mother's grief turns into calculated revenge, if you want to know whether we found proof of what the Ashford family did, then you need to subscribe. You need to be here for what comes next. And check the description box below. There are more stories like this, stories about justice that come slowly but completely. I stayed in Dubai for 3 months, and in that time, I transformed from Helen Patterson, factory worker and grieving mother, into someone I barely recognized. Someone harder. Someone who understood that justice sometimes requires strategy, patience, and the kind of long-term planning that Daniel had excelled at. Layla became my teacher, spending hours every day walking me through financial statements, market analysis, client relations, and operational management. She was patient with my questions, never made me feel stupid for not understanding aviation terminology or international business practices. Gradually, the numbers started to make sense. I began to see the patterns, understand the strategies that Daniel and Rashid had employed to build Diamond Sky into the success it was. Rashid introduced me to clients, and I learned that wealth at this level operated by different rules than anything I'd known. These weren't people who worried about bills or budgeted for groceries. They thought in terms of investments, portfolios, legacy, and they respected competence and discretion above all else. As Daniel's mother and the new co-owner of Diamond Sky, I was welcomed into their world with a courtesy that would have been unthinkable back in Denver. I attended business dinners where a single meal cost more than I used to spend on food in a month. I visited private islands and stayed in hotels where the bathrooms were bigger than my old apartment. And slowly, I learned to navigate this world without feeling like an imposter. I learned to speak their language, understand their concerns, anticipate their needs. But every night, when I returned to my villa on Palm Jumeirah, I would sit on the terrace and read through Daniel's letter again. I would remember why I was doing this. Not for the money, not for the lifestyle, but for justice. For my son. Rashid's investigators in Denver were busy. Every week, he would share new information they'd uncovered about the Ashford family. And the picture that emerged was chilling. Randolph Ashford had indeed had 3 business partners who died under suspicious circumstances. The first, 25 years ago, had supposedly committed suicide by jumping from his office building. But there were no witnesses, and he'd shown no signs of depression. His shares in the hotel chain Randolph owned had passed to Randolph for a fraction of their value, per a buy-sell agreement. The second partner had died in a boating accident 15 years ago. He'd been an experienced sailor, but his boat had exploded in the middle of the night while docked at a marina. The investigation concluded it was a fuel leak, but the partner's widow had always insisted the boat had just been serviced and inspected. She tried to sue Randolph but couldn't prove anything. She'd settled for pennies on the dollar and disappeared from Denver society. The third partner, and this made my blood run cold, had died in a car accident 10 years ago. Brake failure on a mountain road. Sound familiar? The police had ruled it an accident. Randolph had mourned publicly, given a moving eulogy, and then quietly taken control of the luxury resort they'd been developing together. 3 partners, 3 convenient deaths, Rashid said when he showed me this information. And now Daniel. 4, if our suspicions are correct. But suspicions weren't proof. And we needed proof before we could move against them. The investigators also uncovered information about Preston's business practices. He'd been fired from 2 previous companies for financial irregularities, nothing provable enough for criminal charges, but enough to make him unemployable in Denver's tight-knit business community. Until Daniel had hired him, giving him a chance because Victoria had asked. Daniel had always been too kind, too willing to see the best in people. Preston had been systematically positioning himself to take over Patterson Aviation for years. He'd cultivated relationships with Daniel's key clients, positioned himself as the heir apparent, made himself indispensable. Employees at Patterson Aviation told the investigators that Preston had been spreading subtle rumors about Daniel being burned out, distracted, possibly making poor business decisions. Nothing overt, nothing Daniel could confront him about. Just a slow poison, preparing everyone for an eventual leadership change. And Victoria? She'd been playing her own game. The investigators discovered she'd been having an affair with a Denver city councilman for the past 2 years. The same city councilman who sat on the board that approved airport zoning and development permits. The same board that would oversee any changes to Patterson Aviation's operations. Every piece of information Rashid shared with me added fuel to the fire burning in my chest. These people had orchestrated every detail. They'd married into Daniel's life, infiltrated his business, positioned themselves to take everything. And when Daniel had proven less pliable than they'd hoped, when they'd perhaps started to suspect he was onto them, they'd killed him. I couldn't prove it yet. But I knew it in my bones. During this time, I maintained minimal contact with Victoria. She called once a week, always in the evening Denver time, always with that same tone of concerned sympathy. Helen, how are you holding up? I worry about you all alone in that little house. She didn't know I was calling her from a terrace overlooking the Persian Gulf, or that the little house she referenced was now rented out to a nice young couple while I lived in a multimillion-dollar villa. I'm managing, I would say, keeping my voice small and sad. Some days are harder than others. I understand completely. Listen, I've been thinking, why don't you come stay with me for a while? The mansion feels so empty now. We could keep each other company. The thought of living under Victoria's roof, breathing the same air as the woman who'd killed my son, made my stomach turn. But I kept my voice grateful, weak. That's so kind, Victoria. But I think I need my own space right now. Being in Daniel's house would be too painful. Of course, of course. Well, the offer stands. And Helen? I want you to know that Preston and I are working so hard to honor Daniel's legacy. Patterson Aviation is in good hands. Patterson Aviation. The shell company they thought was worth $20 million. I wondered when they'd realize the contracts were gone, the profitable routes sold off, the actual value decimated. According to Rashid's contacts, they were still in the honeymoon phase, too busy celebrating their inheritance to look closely at the books. That's good to hear, I said, injecting just the right amount of grateful relief into my voice. Daniel worked so hard to build that company. I'm glad it's with family. After I hung up, I would sit there, phone in hand, and let the rage wash over me. Then I'd channel it into my work, into learning everything I could about Diamond Sky, about international business, about the kind of power that money could buy. Layla noticed the change in me. One evening, about 2 months into my stay, she asked me to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Dubai Marina. We sat at a table with a view of luxury yachts bobbing in the water, their lights reflecting off the dark surface. You're different than when you arrived, Layla said, studying me over her wine glass. Harder. More focused. I'm not criticizing, I'm just observing. I considered lying, keeping up the facade. But something about Layla's direct gaze made me want to be honest. I'm learning, I said. Learning that the world Daniel lived in wasn't the simple one I thought it was. Learning that sometimes you have to be hard to survive. Rashid told me about the Ashford family, Layla said quietly. About the investigation. I want you to know that everyone at Diamond Sky is behind you. Whatever you need, whatever you're planning, we're with you. I felt a lump form in my throat. Why? You barely know me. Because Mr. Daniel was one of the good ones. Because he built something here that mattered, that gave people opportunities and dignity. And because we all suspected something was wrong in his marriage. We saw how he looked sometimes, when he thought no one was watching. Like he was carrying a weight he couldn't share with anyone. Did he ever talk about Victoria? Layla shook her head. Never. But he talked about you constantly. About how proud he was of you, how you'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. He said his biggest regret was that his success had come too late for you to enjoy your younger years, that by the time he could afford to give you everything, you were already past the age to really live it. That's not true, I said. Every moment of his success was a gift to me. Just knowing he was happy, that he'd built something from nothing, that was enough. Was it though? Layla leaned forward. Mrs. Patterson, you're 63 years old. You have decades left, if you're healthy. Decades with more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. The question isn't just about revenge or justice, it's about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Who you're going to become. Her words stayed with me long after dinner ended. Who was I going to become? The old Helen Patterson had been defined by sacrifice, by making do, by putting everyone else first. But that Helen had also been powerless, invisible, someone the Ashford family could laugh at and dismiss. This new version of me had resources, knowledge, allies. This version could fight back. But would fighting consume me? Would I become so focused on revenge that I'd forget to actually live? I didn't have answers yet. But I knew I couldn't move forward until I'd settled accounts with the people who'd taken my son from me. The breakthrough came in my 3rd month in Dubai. Rashid called me at midnight, his voice tight with excitement. Mrs. Patterson, we have something. Something big. I threw on a robe and met him at the Diamond Sky offices. He was there with 2 other men I didn't recognize, one middle-aged and weathered, the other younger but with sharp, intelligent eyes. This is Jack Morrison, Rashid said, gesturing to the older man. He's the private investigator I hired in Denver. And this is his associate, Tom Chen. He stopped, shook his head. Sorry, Tom Williams. I get names mixed up when I'm excited. Tom Williams nodded at me, then pulled out a laptop. Mrs. Patterson, we've been digging into Preston Ashford's finances. Specifically, his bank accounts and credit card statements from the month before your son died. He turned the laptop so I could see the screen. It showed a spreadsheet with rows of transactions highlighted in yellow. 3 weeks before Daniel's death, Preston made a cash withdrawal of $15,000. That's unusual for him. He typically uses credit cards for everything. 2 days later, there's a charge to a company called Mountain State Automotive Services. A mechanic? I asked. Not exactly. Mountain State Automotive Services doesn't exist as a registered business in Colorado. The address listed is a P.O. box in a strip mall in Aurora. We tracked down the P.O. box, and it's rented under a fake name. But we found something interesting. Security camera footage from the strip mall shows a man matching Preston's description visiting that P.O. box the day after your son's accident. My heart was pounding. He was checking to see if someone had contacted him. That's our theory. We think Preston hired someone to sabotage Daniel's car. The $15,000 was payment. And Mountain State Automotive Services was the cover. If anyone looked at his credit card statement, they'd just see a charge to what appeared to be a legitimate auto service company. But can we prove it? I asked. Can we prove Preston paid someone to kill Daniel? Jack Morrison spoke up, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. Not yet. But we're getting close. We found the mechanic who serviced Daniel's car at the dealership. He's willing to testify that when he picked up the car from the Patterson home, Victoria specifically asked him to leave it in the parking lot overnight instead of returning it that evening like he usually would. She said Daniel needed it first thing in the morning and she didn't want the mechanic waking them up with the delivery. But it sat in the parking lot all night, I said, understanding dawning. Accessible to anyone who wanted to tamper with it. Exactly. And the dealership security cameras from that night show a figure in dark clothing entering the parking lot around 2 a.m. The footage is grainy, but the person clearly approaches Daniel's car, spends about 40 minutes underneath it, then leaves. We've sent the footage to a forensic video analyst to see if we can get a better image of the person's face. Even if we can't identify them, Tom added, we have enough to establish a pattern. We have Preston's suspicious cash withdrawal and fake payment. We have Victoria arranging for the car to be left vulnerable. We have video of someone tampering with the car. And we have the brake line failure that caused the accident. It's circumstantial, but it's strong. Is it strong enough for the police? I asked. Jack and Tom exchanged glances. That's complicated, Jack said. The case was closed as an accident. Getting the Denver PD to reopen it would require substantial political pressure. And the Ashford family has connections in the department. Randolph Ashford plays golf with the chief of police. So what do we do? My voice was hard, cold. We have evidence they killed my son, but we can't use it. We could go to the FBI, Tom suggested. If there was a conspiracy that crossed state lines, or if there are other victims, it becomes a federal matter. They'd have jurisdiction regardless of local politics. But that would take time, Rashid said. Years, maybe. Federal investigations move slowly. And in the meantime, the Ashford family continues living their lives, spending Daniel's money, running his company into the ground. I stood up, paced to the window. The diamond sky hangar was lit up in the darkness, and I could see Helen's Dream sitting on the tarmac, ready for its next flight. Daniel had built all this in secret, had played a long game with incredible patience. But he'd also been preparing for the possibility that something would happen to him before he could expose the Ashford family. What would Daniel want me to do? The answer came to me clearly. He wouldn't want years of trials and appeals. He wouldn't want to give the Ashford family the attention and platform that a criminal prosecution would provide. He'd want them destroyed quietly, thoroughly, in a way that left them with nothing but the knowledge that they'd been outmaneuvered by the woman they'd dismissed as worthless. We don't go to the police, I said, turning back to face them. Not yet, anyway. We use this information differently. We let them think they're safe, that they've gotten away with it. And then we take everything from them. Their money, their reputation, their power, their freedom. But we do it our way, on our timeline. Rashid smiled slowly. What did you have in mind? First, we need to know exactly what they have. What's the real value of what they inherited from Daniel? How much have they spent? What's their financial situation? I want a complete picture. We can get that, Jack said. I have contacts who can access financial records. Second, I want to know every shady deal, every questionable business practice, every skeleton in the Ashford family closet. If Randolph really did kill or harm his previous business partners, there must be evidence somewhere. We find it. All of it. That will take time, Tom warned. And money. I have both, I said. Diamond Sky is profitable, and I'm not going anywhere. We take as long as we need to build an airtight case. Not for the police, for the court of public opinion. For their business partners, their social circle, their clients. We expose them for what they are. And third. Rashid prompted. Third, we wait for the perfect moment. The moment when exposing them will cause maximum damage. When they're most vulnerable, most confident, most convinced they've won. I looked at each of them in turn. Can you do this? Can you help me destroy the people who killed my son? They all nodded, their faces grim but determined. Good, I said. Then let's get to work. If you're still with me, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about a mother learning to use the tools her son left her. It's about patience and planning and the kind of justice that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. Subscribe if you want to see how this ends. And check the description box below for more stories about the slow, satisfying revenge that comes when you're underestimated. Over the next 3 months, while I continued to run Diamond Sky Aviation and learn the ins and outs of international business, Jack Morrison and Tom Williams built a case against the Ashford family that was devastating in its thoroughness. They found the widow of Randolph's second business partner, the one who'd died in the boat explosion. She'd moved to Oregon, remarried, tried to build a new life. But she'd never forgotten her suspicions about her first husband's death. She still had boxes of documents from the business, including emails that showed Randolph had been systematically undermining her husband's authority in their company, turning board members against him, setting him up to be forced out. The boat explosion had happened 3 days before a scheduled board meeting where the vote to oust him would have taken place. My husband knew something was wrong, she told Jack during a recorded interview. He'd hired his own investigators to look into some financial irregularities. He thought Randolph was embezzling from the company. He was going to expose it all at that board meeting. And then his boat exploded, and the investigation found that all his files about the embezzlement had been on his laptop, which was on the boat. Everything was destroyed. Convenient, Jack had noted in his report to me. They tracked down employees who'd worked for the Ashford family hotel chain over the years. Many had stories of intimidation, of being forced to lie or cover up problems, of witnessing illegal practices. A former accountant was willing to testify that he'd been asked to create fake financial statements to inflate the company's value during a refinancing. When he'd refused, he'd been fired and blacklisted in the industry. And they found the girlfriend of the mechanic Preston had hired to tamper with Daniel's car. She didn't know exactly what her boyfriend had done, but she knew he'd been paid in cash to do a special job for a rich guy in Denver. She knew the job had been on a car, that it was supposed to look like an accident. And she knew her boyfriend had been terrified afterward, when he'd realized the car's owner had died. He couldn't sleep for weeks, she told Tom Williams. He kept saying he didn't think anyone would actually die, that the guy who hired him said it was just supposed to be a scare, make the guy crash but not seriously hurt him. But then it was all over the news, and my boyfriend knew he'd killed someone. He started drinking heavily, got into drugs. 6 months later, he overdosed. I always thought it was suicide, that the guilt ate him alive. The mechanic was dead, which meant he couldn't testify. But his girlfriend could testify about his confession to her. And text messages between her and the mechanic from that time period corroborated her story. The web of evidence was growing, becoming undeniable. But it still wasn't quite enough for criminal prosecution. Too much circumstantial evidence, too many dead witnesses, too much time passed. A good defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. But for what I had planned, it would be more than enough. They're starting to panic, Rashid told me one morning over coffee at the Diamond Sky offices. Victoria and Preston. My contacts at Patterson Aviation say they've finally started going through the books carefully, and they're realizing something is very wrong. The missing contracts, I said, feeling a savage satisfaction. Exactly. They're discovering that most of the profitable business is gone. The company still has the planes and the airport, but without those international routes and corporate contracts, they're essentially running a glorified taxi service for rich people around Denver. The revenue is maybe a tenth of what they thought it would be. How are they reacting? Preston is trying to renegotiate the contracts, but the companies Daniel sold them to have ironclad agreements. And those companies are performing better than Patterson Aviation ever did, because Daniel made sure they got the best pilots, the best routes, the best terms. Patterson Aviation can't compete. And Victoria? She's trying to sell some assets to raise cash. The mansion is on the market. She's liquidating the investment portfolio. But it's not going to be enough. They have massive overhead costs from the airport and the remaining fleet, and not enough income to cover it. Within a year, maybe less, Patterson Aviation will be bankrupt. I sipped my coffee, let the information sink in. Daniel had planned this so carefully. He'd left them with all the visible symbols of wealth, the mansion, the company name, the physical assets, but stripped away everything that actually generated value. It was brilliant and brutal. There's something else, Rashid said, his tone careful. Preston has been making inquiries about Diamond Sky Aviation. He's asking around Dubai business circles, trying to find out who owns it. He knows the name because it appeared on some of the contract transfers, but Daniel kept the ownership structure so complex that it's not easy to trace. My blood ran cold. Does he know about me? Not yet. But he's getting closer. Mrs. Patterson, I think it's time to consider moving to the next phase of the plan. If Preston figures out that you're here, that you own half of Diamond Sky, it could complicate things. He was right. I'd been in Dubai for 6 months now. I'd learned the business, built relationships, established myself as a serious player in the aviation industry. I'd become someone the Ashford family wouldn't recognize, confident, powerful, wealthy beyond their comprehension. It was time to go home. Not to hide, but to watch the final act of their downfall play out in person. Set up a meeting with Jack and Tom, I said. I want to review everything we have. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every document. And then I want you to help me plan my return to Denver. Because it's time for Victoria and her family to learn that the old woman they laughed at is the one holding all the cards. I flew back to Denver on Helen's Dream, my first time actually traveling in the jet Daniel had named after me. Rashid had insisted, said it was fitting that I return home in style. The plane was everything he described, luxurious leather seats, a bedroom suite, a full galley where a chef prepared meals during the flight. The flight crew treated me with deference that still felt strange, calling me Mrs. Patterson in tones that suggested respect rather than pity. During the 14-hour flight, I reviewed the file Jack Morrison had prepared. It was 3 inches thick, organized into sections with tabs. Evidence of tampering, Randolph Ashford's history, Preston's financial crimes, Victoria's affairs and deception, corporate fraud. Every page was damning. Every document was verified, authenticated, backed up with witness statements or financial records. It was enough to destroy them. The question was how and when to deploy it for maximum impact. The plane landed at a private airstrip outside Denver, not at Patterson Aviation's airport. I didn't want Victoria or Preston knowing I was back yet. I wanted to watch them first, see how they were handling the slow realization that their inheritance was worthless. My house, the small 2-bedroom Daniel had bought me 10 years ago, was exactly as I'd left it. Mrs. Rodriguez had kept the plants watered and the mail collected. I walked through the rooms, touching familiar things, and felt like I was visiting a museum of my old life. The worn furniture, the carpet that needed replacing, the kitchen where I'd made thousands of simple meals. This had been my world for so long. Now it felt impossibly small. But I stayed there rather than checking into a hotel. I needed people to believe I was still the same Helen Patterson, still struggling, still grieving, still powerless. The next morning, I called Victoria. Helen. She sounded genuinely surprised. You're back in Denver. When did you get home? Late last night, I said, making my voice tired, sad. I've been traveling a bit, trying to clear my head. Visiting some places Daniel and I always talked about going to together. Where did you go? Oh, just around. California, Arizona. Nothing exciting. But it helped to get away for a while. I'm so glad, Victoria said, and if I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed the warmth in her voice. Listen, I want to see you. Can you come by the house? She caught herself. Sorry, I still think of it as Daniel's house. Can you come by for lunch tomorrow? I'd love to catch up. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. But I needed to see her, needed to look her in the eye and maintain my facade while knowing what she'd done. That would be lovely, I said. The next day, I dressed in my simplest clothes, old jeans, a cardigan with a small stain on the sleeve, comfortable shoes that had seen better days. I wanted to look exactly like what Victoria expected. A poor old woman barely scraping by. The mansion in Cherry Creek looked the same from the outside, but when Victoria opened the door, I could see changes immediately. Some of the furniture was gone, probably sold. The expensive artwork that had hung in the foyer was replaced with cheaper prints. Small economizing measures that suggested financial pressure. Helen, Victoria said, hugging me. She smelled like expensive perfume, but her designer dress looked slightly worn. Come in, come in. I've missed you. She led me to the kitchen, Not the formal dining room, I noticed, where she'd prepared a simple lunch. Sandwiches and salad. Not the catered affairs she used to host. "How have you been?" I asked, playing my role perfectly. It must be so hard, living in this big house alone. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "It's been an adjustment. Actually, Helen, I need to talk to you about something. The house is on the market." "You're selling it?" I let my surprise show. But this was Daniel's dream home. "I know, but it's just too much space for one person. And honestly..." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "The maintenance costs are significant. With the company restructuring, it makes sense to downsize." "Restructuring?" I prompted innocently. "Oh, it's nothing to worry about. Just some adjustments Preston and I are making. The aviation industry is going through changes. You know. We're adapting." The lie came smoothly, practiced. "Actually, we're doing quite well. Preston has some exciting plans for expansion." I'd bet he did. Expansion with what money? I wanted to ask. But I kept my expression sympathetic and clueless. "That's wonderful," I said. "Daniel would be so proud that his company is in good hands." Victoria looked at me with what might have been genuine curiosity. "Helen, I've been meaning to ask, that envelope Daniel left you. What was in it?" My heart rate increased, but I kept my face calm. "Oh, just a sweet note. Telling me he loved me, that he'd always be with me. That sort of thing." It wasn't entirely a lie. Those sentiments had been in his letter, just surrounded by information about a secret empire. Nothing else? No. Instructions or information about anything. She was fishing, I realized. Trying to figure out if Daniel had left me any clues about his secret dealings. "No, nothing like that. Why do you ask?" "No reason. I just thought maybe he'd left you something more practical. You know, to help with expenses." She reached across the table and patted my hand. "I worry about you, Helen. Are you managing okay financially?" "Oh, I'm fine," I said, making my voice deliberately vague. "Social Security and my pension, you know. I make do." "Well, the offer still stands. If you ever need anything, money, a place to stay, anything at all, you just have to ask. Your family." Family. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. But I smiled and thanked her and finished my sandwich while she chatted about neighborhood gossip and charity events she was planning. All surface, no substance. Just like their entire relationship with Daniel had been. When I left 2 hours later, I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine. I'd just had lunch with the woman who'd killed my son. Who'd arranged for his brakes to be sabotaged, who'd set him up to die on that mountain road. And I'd smiled and chatted and played the role of the pathetic old woman who suspected nothing. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. That evening, Jack Morrison came to my house. He looked around at the modest furnishings, the worn carpet, and said, "You know, Mrs. Patterson, you don't have to live like this anymore. You could buy any house in Denver you wanted." "I know," I said. "But this is part of the plan. Victoria needs to believe I'm still struggling, still the same old Helen she dismissed. The moment I show any signs of wealth, she'll start asking questions." "Speaking of questions," Jack said, pulling out his laptop, "Preston has been making more inquiries about Diamond Sky Aviation. He hired his own investigator, a guy named Mike Thompson, used to be Denver PD, went private. Thompson's been asking around the Dubai business community, trying to trace the ownership structure. Will he find me? Eventually, maybe. The corporate structures Rashid and Daniel set up are complex, but they're not impenetrable. If Thompson is good, and he is, he'll eventually connect the dots." Jack looked at me seriously. "We need to move soon, Mrs. Patterson. Before they figure out what Daniel really did." "I agree. Have you heard back from the journalist?" A month ago, Jack had reached out to a reporter named Elizabeth Harris, at the Denver Post. She was an investigative journalist with a reputation for taking down corrupt businesspeople and politicians. Jack had given her a few hints about the Ashford family, enough to pique her interest without revealing everything we knew. "She's interested," Jack said. "Very interested. She's been doing her own digging into Randolph Ashford's business history. She found some things we missed, another suspicious insurance claim from 15 years ago, a warehouse fire that destroyed evidence of tax fraud right before an audit. This guy has been playing dirty for decades. Can we trust her? If we give her everything we have, will she run with it? Or will the Ashford family's connections kill the story? Elizabeth has a reputation for being fearless. She's taken on the mayor, the police chief, major corporations. If we give her enough evidence, she'll publish. But she'll want to verify everything independently. That means interviews, document review, probably a couple months of work. We don't have a couple months, I said. Preston is closing in on the truth about Diamond Sky. Once he figures out I'm connected to it, everything changes. Jack leaned back in his chair, thinking. What if we accelerate the timeline? What if we give Elizabeth everything now, on the condition that she publishes within 2 weeks? We can help her verify sources, connect her with witnesses, make it as easy as possible for her to confirm the facts. Would she agree to that? If the story is big enough, and exclusive enough? Yes. She'd want to break it before anyone else gets wind of it. I thought about Daniel, about the years he'd spent planning in secret, about the patience he'd shown, the careful strategy, but I also thought about the risks of waiting too long, of Preston discovering the truth before we were ready to reveal it on our terms. Set up a meeting with Elizabeth, I said. But not here. Somewhere neutral. And Jack? Make sure we're not followed. If Preston's investigator is watching me, I don't want him knowing I'm meeting with a journalist. 3 days later, I met Elizabeth Harris at a coffee shop in Golden, a small town outside Denver. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She shook my hand firmly and ordered us both coffee before getting down to business. Mrs. Patterson, she said, pulling out a recorder and notebook, Jack Morrison has told me some remarkable things about your son's death and the Ashford family's business practices. Before we go any further, I need to know, are you prepared for what publishing this story will mean? The Ashford family will fight back. They'll hire lawyers, try to discredit you, maybe even come after you personally. This isn't going to be easy. I understand, I said. But they killed my son. And they can't be allowed to get away with it. Elizabeth studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. Show me what you have. For the next 3 hours, I walked her through everything. The evidence of Daniel's brake lines being tampered with. Preston's suspicious financial transactions. Victoria's arrangement to leave the car vulnerable. The pattern of deaths surrounding Randolph Ashford's business deals. The embezzlement, the fraud, the affairs, the lies. Elizabeth took notes furiously, occasionally stopping me to ask clarifying questions or request specific documentation. When I was finished, she sat back and let out a low whistle. This is bigger than I thought, she said. This isn't just about your son's death. This is about a family that's been operating like an organized crime syndicate for decades. If I can verify even half of this, it's Pulitzer-worthy. Can you verify it? I asked. Most of it, yes. I'll need to interview the widow in Oregon, track down some of these former employees, confirm the financial records. But Jack has given me a solid foundation. I can build on this. She looked at me intently. But Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask, what's your goal here? Justice? Revenge? Closure? I thought about that question, about the 6 months I'd spent in Dubai learning to navigate a world of wealth and power. About the nights I'd spent reading Daniel's letter, crying over what could have been. About the lunch with Victoria, smiling while rage burned in my chest. All of the above, I said finally. I want the world to know what they did. I want them to pay. And I want Daniel's real legacy, Diamond Sky Aviation, the empire he built in secret, to be recognized. I want people to know that my son was brilliant, that he outmaneuvered them even from the grave. Elizabeth smiled. I can make that happen. Give me 2 weeks. One more thing, I said. When you publish, I want to be the one to tell Victoria and Preston. I want to see their faces when they realize what's about to hit them. That, Elizabeth said, I can definitely arrange. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of anxious anticipation. Elizabeth worked around the clock, calling witnesses, reviewing documents, building her story. She kept me updated every few days, confirming pieces of evidence, asking follow-up questions. Meanwhile, Victoria called twice, both times trying to subtly probe about whether I knew anything about Diamond Sky Aviation. I played dumb, said I'd never heard of it, that I didn't know much about Daniel's business dealings beyond Patterson Aviation. Just wondering, Victoria said the second time, her voice strained. Preston mentioned the name in connection with some contract transfers. We're trying to understand some business decisions Daniel made in his final months. It's all very confusing. I'm sure it is, I said sympathetically. Daniel was so smart about business. Sometimes even I couldn't follow what he was doing. After I hung up, I allowed myself a small smile. They were panicking now, trying to figure out what Daniel had done, where the money had gone. Soon, they'd have their answers. And those answers would destroy them. The call came on a Wednesday evening. Elizabeth, we're ready to publish. Sunday edition, front page, above the fold. Denver aviation mogul's death may have been murder, investigation reveals. With a follow-up piece about the Ashford family's history of suspicious business dealings. My hands shook as I held the phone. This was it. The moment Daniel had been building toward. The moment I'd been planning for 6 months. I want to tell them first, I said. Saturday afternoon. Before the paper hits the stands on Sunday morning. I'll be there to cover their reaction, Elizabeth said. This is going to be the story of my career, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for trusting me with it. After we hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about what came next. Once the story published, everything would change. Victoria and Preston would know the truth about Daniel's secret company. They'd know I'd been the one to expose them. They'd come after me with everything they had. But I'd be ready. I had Rashid and Layla and the entire Diamond Sky Aviation team behind me. I had lawyers, investigators, and a journalist who'd done meticulous work documenting their crimes. I had Daniel's letter, his plans, his blessing. And most importantly, I had the truth. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, winter settling into Denver with the kind of crisp air that made everything feel sharp and defined. I dressed carefully, not in my usual worn clothes, but in one of the designer outfits Layla had helped me pick out in Dubai. A tailored black pantsuit that made me look powerful, professional. Expensive but understated jewelry. Hairstyled, makeup applied with care. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. The old Helen would have felt like an imposter in these clothes. But this Helen, the one who'd spent 6 months learning to run an international aviation company, who'd built alliances and strategies, who'd planned the downfall of the people who'd killed her son, this Helen wore power comfortably. I called Victoria at 10 a.m. Helen. How nice to hear from you, she said, though her voice sounded strained. Is everything all right? I need to speak with you and Preston, I said, my tone businesslike. Today. It's important. Oh, well, I'm not sure if Preston is available. Make him available, Victoria. Trust me, you'll both want to hear what I have to say. 2 o'clock at the mansion. Don't be late. I hung up before she could respond, letting the unusual assertiveness in my tone unsettle her. Jack Morrison and Elizabeth Harris met me for lunch at a restaurant downtown. Jack looked nervous but excited. Elizabeth was cool, professional, her recorder and notebook ready. You sure you want to do this? Jack asked. Once you walk into that house and confront them, there's no going back. They'll know you were behind the investigation. I'm sure, I said. Daniel spent years playing games with them, pretending everything was fine while they plotted against him. I'm done pretending. It's time they faced consequences. The paper goes to print tonight, Elizabeth said. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Denver will know the Ashford family's secrets. Their business associates, their friends, everyone at that country club Victoria loves so much. Are you prepared for them to know you're the source? Let them know, I said. Let everyone know that Helen Patterson, the old woman they laughed at, the mother they dismissed as worthless, is the one who brought them down. At 1:30, Jack drove me to Cherry Creek. Elizabeth followed in her own car, parking down the street where she could observe but wouldn't be immediately visible. The plan was for me to go in alone first, confront Victoria and Preston with what I knew, and give them a chance to respond before the story published. Elizabeth would listen from outside, record anything she could hear, and potentially intervene if things got dangerous. I felt surprisingly calm as I walked up to the mansion's front door. This house that had intimidated me the first time I'd visited, that had represented everything Daniel had achieved and everything Victoria had stolen, it was just a building now. Just stuff. What mattered was inside. Victoria answered the door, And I saw her eyes widen slightly as she took in my appearance. "Helen, you look different. Can I come in?" She stepped aside, clearly off balance. "Preston is in the study. I'll get him." She led me to the same formal dining room where we'd had lunch a few weeks ago, but this time the table was bare, no food or pleasantries. Preston arrived a moment later, looking annoyed at being summoned. "Helen," he said with barely concealed condescension. "Victoria said you needed to speak with us urgently. What's this about?" I sat down at the head of the table, Daniel's seat, and pulled out a folder from my bag. Inside were copies of everything: the evidence of tampering, the financial records, the witness statements, the photographs of Preston at the P.O. box. "This is about murder," I said calmly. "And fraud. And the fact that tomorrow morning, the Denver Post is publishing a story that will destroy both of you and your entire family." The color drained from Victoria's face. Preston's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria said, but her voice shook. "Don't you?" I slid the first photograph across the table, the image of someone tampering with Daniel's car in the dealership parking lot. "This was taken the night before my son died. The night you arranged for his car to be left unattended in an unsecured parking lot. The night someone cut his brake lines." "That's ridiculous," Preston said, but he'd gone pale. "That could be anyone." "It could be," I agreed. "Except that 2 weeks before this photo was taken, you withdrew $15,000 in cash. And the day after my son died, you visited a P.O. box rented under a fake name, registered to a non-existent company called Mountain State Automotive Services. The same company that appeared on your credit card statement." I slid more documents across the table: bank statements, credit card records, security footage of Preston at the strip mall. "You hired someone to sabotage Daniel's car," I continued, my voice steady despite the rage boiling inside me. "Victoria arranged for the car to be vulnerable. And my son died on that mountain road because you both wanted his company, his money, his life." "This is insane," Victoria said, standing up. "You can't prove any of this. That photo is grainy. It could be anyone. Preston's financial transactions are his own business." "Sit down, Victoria." My voice cracked like a whip, and to my satisfaction, she Saturday. "I can prove all of it. The mechanic who tampered with the car confessed to his girlfriend before he died. She's willing to testify. The forensic analysis of Daniel's brake lines shows they were deliberately cut. And Preston's financial trail leads directly to the man who did it. Even if that were true, which it's not, it's circumstantial," Preston said, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "No prosecutor would touch this." "You're probably right," I said. "Which is why I didn't go to the prosecutors. I went to the Denver Post. Elizabeth Harris has been investigating your family for the past 2 weeks. Not just Daniel's death, but everything. All 3 of your father's business partners who died under suspicious circumstances: Randolph. The embezzlement, the fraud, the insurance scams. 30 years of criminal activity, all documented, all verified with witnesses and financial records." "You're bluffing," Preston said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Then how do I know about the widow in Oregon, the one your father forced to settle for pennies on the dollar after her husband's boat exploded? How do I know about the accountant your family blacklisted for refusing to cook the books? How do I know about Victoria's affair with Councilman Bradshaw, the one she's been using to manipulate airport zoning decisions?" Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. "How?" "Because I've spent 6 months investigating you," I said. 6 months learning everything about the Ashford family. 6 months preparing to destroy you the same way you destroyed my son." Preston stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "You crazy old woman. You have no idea what you're dealing with. My father has connections in this city. He'll bury you. He'll bury this story. And you'll be the one who ends up looking like a pathetic, delusional grief-stricken mother who couldn't accept that her son died in an accident." "Maybe," I said calmly. "Except for one thing. Daniel knew what you were planning. He knew you were going to take everything from him. So he protected himself. And he protected me." I pulled out the final document, the corporate registration for Diamond Sky Aviation, showing my name as 50% owner. "Diamond Sky Aviation," I said, watching comprehension dawn on their faces. "The company Daniel built in Dubai. The one you've been so desperately trying to track down for the past month." The company that bought all of Patterson Aviation's valuable contracts and routes for fair market value, completely legally, before Daniel died. No, Victoria whispered. Yes. Daniel transferred $32 million out of Patterson Aviation by selling off everything of real value. What you inherited, the planes, the airport, the mansion, it's all worthless without those contracts. Patterson Aviation is a shell company bleeding money. In 6 months, maybe less, you'll be bankrupt. That's fraud, Preston snarled. That's illegal asset transfer. It's not fraud when the sole owner and CEO of a company decides to sell assets, I said. Daniel had every legal right to restructure his business. And he did it through legitimate business transactions with legitimate companies. You can try to sue, but you'll lose. And you'll spend every penny you have left on legal fees in the process. I stood up, gathering my documents. Diamond Sky Aviation is worth $40 million now. Daniel's share is mine, held in trusts that are completely protected from American probate law. I'm a wealthy woman, Victoria. Wealthier than you ever will be. Wealthier than you ever dreamed. Victoria's face had gone from pale to flushed, tears streaming down her cheeks. You can't do this. Daniel was my husband. I loved him. You loved his money, I said coldly. You loved what he could give you. You never loved him. If you had, you wouldn't have married him with the intention of stealing everything he'd built. You wouldn't have had him killed when he became inconvenient. We didn't kill him. Victoria screamed. It was an accident. Was it? Then explain the brake lines. Explain Preston's cash withdrawal. Explain the mechanic's confession to his girlfriend before he conveniently overdosed. Preston moved toward me, his fists clenched, and for a moment I thought he might actually hit me. But the door opened and Elizabeth Harris walked in, her recorder held high. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Ashford, she said calmly. I've been recording this entire conversation from outside. Assaulting Mrs. Patterson right now would be a very bad idea. Preston froze. Victoria let out a sob. Elizabeth Harris, Denver Post, Elizabeth said, pulling out her press credentials. I'm running a story tomorrow morning about the Ashford family's history of suspicious business dealings, including allegations that you conspired to murder Daniel Patterson. Would either of you care to comment for the record? Get out, Preston said, his voice shaking with rage. Both of you, get out of this house. Gladly, I said. Enjoy your last night of freedom. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know what you are. Your business associates will abandon you. Your friends will turn their backs. Your father's hotels will be investigated by every regulatory agency in Colorado. And you'll spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders, wondering when the FBI will finally have enough evidence to file criminal charges. I walked to the door, then turned back. Oh, and Victoria, I'm glad you're selling the mansion. Because when Patterson Aviation goes bankrupt, and it will, you'll need every penny you can scrape together for lawyers. Though I doubt it will be enough. Elizabeth and I walked out together, leaving Victoria sobbing and Preston standing there white-faced and silent. Jack was waiting by the car, and as soon as we got in, he drove away quickly. Holy hell, Elizabeth said, checking her recorder. That was better than I could have imagined. Preston practically admitted to the murder. Victoria's reaction, the way Preston threatened you, it's all recorded. Will you use it? I asked. Every word. This makes the story even stronger. She looked at me with something like awe. Mrs. Patterson, you just faced down the people who killed your son and told them exactly how you're going to destroy them. That took incredible courage. It wasn't courage, I said quietly. It was love. Everything I did for Daniel. The Denver Post hit the streets Sunday morning with the headline, Aviation Mogul's Death Under Investigation, Family Suspected in Murder-for-Hire Scheme. The story ran across 3 full pages, with sidebars detailing Randolph Ashford's history of suspicious business partner deaths and Preston's financial irregularities. But the real bombshell was the second article, running alongside the first, Secret Dubai Empire, How Daniel Patterson Outsmarted His Killers from Beyond the Grave. Elizabeth had written a masterpiece. She detailed Daniel's creation of Diamond Sky Aviation, his careful planning to protect his assets and his mother, his suspicions about his wife and her family. She included quotes from Rashid about Daniel's brilliance and integrity. She revealed the true value of what I'd inherited versus the shell company Victoria had received. The story painted Daniel as a tragic hero, a man who'd seen betrayal coming and had outmaneuvered his enemies even as they plotted his death. And it painted me not as a victim, but as the woman who'd completed her son's plan and brought his killers to justice. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing non-stop. News stations wanted interviews. Lawyers wanted to represent me if the Ashford family sued. The FBI called, asking me to come in for a formal interview about the evidence we'd gathered. But the most satisfying call came from Layla in Dubai. "Mrs. Patterson, you're famous," she said, laughing. The story got picked up internationally. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, everyone is covering it. Diamond Sky Aviation has gotten calls from 24 potential new clients just this morning. Wealthy people love a good revenge story, apparently. "How's business?" I asked. "Booming. We might need to add another aircraft to the fleet just to keep up with demand. When are you coming back?" "Soon," I said, looking around my small house in Denver. "I have a few things to wrap up here first. But Dubai is home now. This place, it's just where I used to live." The FBI investigation moved quickly once they had Elizabeth's story and all our supporting evidence. Within 2 weeks, a grand jury was convened to hear evidence about Daniel's death. Preston's investigator, Mike Thompson, turned on his client when faced with potential charges of obstruction of justice. He testified that Preston had hired him specifically to track down and potentially destroy evidence related to Diamond Sky Aviation. The mechanic's girlfriend testified about her boyfriend's confession. The dealership employee testified about Victoria's unusual request to leave the car overnight. Financial experts testified about Preston's suspicious cash withdrawal and the fake company he'd used to cover the payment. In March, 4 months after Daniel's death, Preston Ashford was indicted for conspiracy to commit murder and murder for hire. Victoria was indicted as an accessory and for conspiracy. Randolph Ashford was indicted on separate charges related to embezzlement and fraud in his hotel business. The investigation into Daniel's death had opened up a whole nest of criminal activity. None of them could make bail. The judge deemed them flight risks with the resources to leave the country. I sat in the courtroom the day they were arraigned, watching them in their orange jumpsuits, no longer polished and powerful but broken and frightened. Preston kept his eyes down, refusing to look at me. Victoria cried throughout, her expensive beauty faded without access to her salon and spa treatments. But Randolph Ashford looked right at me, and in his eyes, I saw pure hatred. He knew I'd destroyed his family. And I met his gaze steadily, without fear, and let him see that I didn't regret a single thing. After the arraignment, I stood on the courthouse steps with Elizabeth Harris and gave my only public statement. "My son Daniel was a brilliant businessman, a loving son, and a good man," I said, my voice steady. "He deserved better than to be married to someone who saw him only as a means to wealth and power. He deserved better than to be murdered for money. Today's indictments don't bring him back, but they ensure that the people who took him from me will face justice. And I want everyone to know, Diamond Sky Aviation, the company Daniel built in secret, continues to thrive. It's his real legacy, and I'm honored to be its guardian." The questions came fast after that, but I declined to answer, simply walking to the car where Jack waited to drive me away. "If you've stayed with me this far, if you've felt every twist of this knife the way I felt it, then I need you to do something. Subscribe. Because this story isn't over. There's still the trial, still the final reckoning. And there's still the question of what happens to me, a woman who got everything she wanted, but lost the person who mattered most. Check the description box below for more stories about revenge, about justice, about the price we pay for both." The trial began in September, 9 months after Daniel's death, and it was the media sensation of the year. Court TV covered it gavel to gavel. Legal analysts debated the evidence every evening. The courthouse was packed with reporters and spectators every single day. I attended every session, sitting in the front row directly behind the prosecution table where the Ashford family couldn't avoid seeing me. I wanted them to face me every day. Wanted them to see Daniel's mother watching as their lies and schemes were exposed for the world to see. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Michelle Reyes, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd built her career on taking down white-collar criminals. She laid out the case methodically, building it piece by piece like a mosaic that only revealed its full picture as each tile was placed. First came the evidence of the brake line tampering. The original police report had classified it as accident damage, but forensic experts testified that the pattern of the break was inconsistent with impact damage. The lines had been partially cut with a sharp tool, designed to fail under hard braking. The defense argued that this was speculation, that the damage could have occurred any number of ways. But the expert testimony was compelling. Then came the dealership mechanic, who testified about Victoria's specific instructions to leave the car in the parking lot overnight. The defense tried to suggest this was normal, but the mechanic explained that in 15 years of servicing high-end vehicles, he'd never had another client make such a request. Expensive cars were always returned promptly or kept in secure facilities, never left vulnerable in open parking lots. The security footage from the dealership was grainy but damning. You could see a figure approaching Daniel's car around 2 a.m., working underneath it for 40 minutes, then leaving. The defense argued the figure could be anyone, a homeless person, a would-be thief, someone completely unrelated to the Ashfords. But then came the mechanic's girlfriend, Stephanie Reynolds. She was in her early 30s, thin and nervous, clearly uncomfortable being in the spotlight. But her testimony was devastating. Tommy came home that night around 3:30 in the morning, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was shaking, said he'd done something bad. Said he'd been paid $15,000 to make a car's brakes fail, but it was supposed to just cause a minor accident, scare someone. He didn't think anyone would actually die. Did he say who hired him? Michelle Reyes asked. Not by name. But he said it was a rich guy from Cherry Creek, someone with a fancy car and an expensive watch. He said the guy had found him through someone who knew someone. You know how that works on the street. Tommy did side jobs sometimes, working on cars under the table. Word got around that he'd do things without asking questions if the money was right. The defense attorney, a slick man named Robert Carrington who charged $1,000 an hour, jumped on this. So your boyfriend never actually identified Preston Ashford as the person who hired him? No, but... And he never showed you any proof of this alleged $15,000 payment? It was cash. He showed me the money. It was in $100 bills, in an envelope. Which you didn't keep. No serial numbers, no photographs, no evidence whatsoever. We spent it, Stephanie said, tears starting to fall. We had rent due, bills. Tommy was scared, he wanted to get rid of it fast. But he told me what he'd done, and then when that businessman died in the car accident, Tommy knew. He knew it was the car he'd worked on. It ate him up inside. That's why he started using drugs again. He couldn't live with what he'd done. Or, Carrington suggested smoothly, your boyfriend was a drug addict who made up stories while he was high, and after this businessman's well-publicized death, he convinced himself he'd been involved when he hadn't been. Stephanie shook her head violently. No. Tommy was clean when it happened. He didn't start using again until after, because of the guilt. The prosecution backed up her testimony with Tommy's text messages to her from that time period. I did something really bad, one read. Got paid but I don't think I can live with it. Another, sent the day after Daniel's death, he died. The guy in the car died. Oh God, what have I done? But the defense pointed out that nowhere in those messages did Tommy explicitly say he'd tampered with anyone's brake lines. It could be interpreted as general guilt, drug-fueled paranoia, anything. The weakest part of the prosecution's case was the direct link between Preston and Tommy. Preston had withdrawn $15,000 in cash. That was documented. He'd made a credit card charge to the fake company Mountain State Automotive Services, also documented. And security footage showed him visiting the P.O. box registered to that fake company the day after Daniel died. But there was no footage of Preston actually meeting with Tommy. No witness who'd seen them together. No phone records connecting them. Preston had likely used a burner phone that was never recovered. Carrington hammered on this point over and over. Circumstantial, he kept saying. Everything about this case is circumstantial. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client murdered his brother-in-law, but they can't prove he ever met the man who allegedly tampered with the car. They can't prove the cash withdrawal was for anything other than legitimate expenses. They can't prove the credit card charge wasn't an honest mistake or error. When Preston took the stand in his own defense, he was smooth, believable. He said the cash withdrawal was for a poker game with friends. He provided names of 3 men who confirmed they'd played poker with him that week, though they couldn't remember the specific amount Preston had brought. He said the charge to Mountain State Automotive Services was a processing error by his credit card company. He tried to charge something to a legitimate auto shop, and somehow the system had generated a charge to a non-existent company instead. These things happened with credit cards all the time. As for the P.O. box visit, he'd been in that strip mall to visit a dry cleaner. Had he walked past a bank of P.O. boxes? Possibly. The security footage showed him in the area, but it didn't definitively show him accessing any specific box. I loved Daniel, Preston said, his voice breaking convincingly. He was family. He gave me a chance when no one else would. Why would I want him dead? Because he was planning to cut you out, Michelle Reyes said during cross-examination. Because you discovered he was selling off assets from Patterson Aviation, and you knew that meant your position in the company was threatened. I didn't know about any asset sales, Preston said. Daniel ran the business. I trusted his decisions. Really? So you had no idea that the company you thought you were inheriting was actually worth a fraction of what you believed? Not until after Daniel's death, when we started going through the books carefully. I assumed it was financial mismanagement, not a deliberate strategy. A deliberate strategy to protect his assets from you and your family. Objection, Carrington said. Speculation. Sustained, the judge ruled. Michelle Reyes tried another angle. Mr. Ashford, were you aware that your father's previous business partners had all died under suspicious circumstances? Objection, Carrington said again. Relevance. The judge looked at Michelle. Counselor. Your Honor, the prosecution contends that the Ashford family has a pattern of eliminating business partners when it's financially convenient. This goes to motive and pattern of behavior. The judge considered. I'll allow it, but tread carefully. Preston's face had gone pale. I knew that my father had lost partners over the years, yes. But they were accidents, tragic coincidences. My father was devastated each time. Were you aware that all three of those partners died shortly before financial irregularities in their shared businesses were about to be exposed? I don't know anything about that. Were you aware that your father profited enormously from each of those deaths? My father is a successful businessman. That doesn't make him a murderer. The prosecution also called witnesses about Preston's previous employment issues, the two companies that had fired him for financial irregularities. Carrington managed to spin this as misunderstandings, personality conflicts with difficult bosses, nothing that rose to the level of criminal behavior. By the time Preston stepped down from the stand, I honestly wasn't sure which way the jury would go. He'd been convincing, had explanations for everything. The evidence against him was strong but circumstantial. Victoria's testimony was less effective. She was too emotional, crying constantly, her answers rambling and inconsistent. She claimed she'd asked for the car to be left overnight because she'd wanted to surprise Daniel with a dinner at home and didn't want the mechanic interrupting them. But phone records showed she'd made no special purchases or reservations that evening. She claimed she knew nothing about Preston's financial transactions or any plot against Daniel. She claimed the marriage had been happy, that she'd loved her husband. Then why were you having an affair with Councilman Bradshaw? Michelle Reyes asked. Victoria's face crumpled. That was a mistake, a moment of weakness. It didn't mean I didn't love Daniel. A 2-year moment of weakness. It's complicated. Marriage is complicated. Did you discuss your husband's business with Councilman Bradshaw? Sometimes, casually. Daniel was always working. It was natural to talk about his business. Did you use information from those conversations to influence zoning decisions that would benefit Patterson Aviation? No. I mean, maybe Brad mentioned things, but I never asked him to do anything improper. The prosecution produced emails between Victoria and the councilman that suggested otherwise, messages where she'd explicitly asked him to help with the airport expansion permits and where he'd replied that he'd take care of it. But again, nothing that directly proved murder. Corruption? Perhaps. Improper influence? Maybe. But not murder. The defense's strategy became clear as the trial progressed. They would admit to ethical lapses, to marital problems, to questionable business practices. But they would maintain that Daniel's death was a tragic accident, that any evidence suggesting otherwise was circumstantial and could be explained away. And then the prosecution called its final witness, Randolph Ashford's second business partner's widow, Margaret Williams. She was in her 70s now, grey-haired and dignified, her voice steady as she testified about the days before her husband's death. Richard told me he'd found evidence that Randolph was embezzling from their resort development, she said. He'd hired forensic accountants, had documentation. He was going to confront Randolph at a board meeting and demand his resignation. That meeting was scheduled for 3 days after Richard died. And Richard's evidence was destroyed in the boat explosion? Michelle asked. His laptop was on the boat, yes. All his files. The accountants he'd hired had copies, but they were intimidated into not testifying. One of them told me years later that he'd received threats, that someone had broken into his office and destroyed his files. He was too frightened to come forward. Objection, Carrington said. This is all hearsay about events from 15 years ago, completely unrelated to the death of Daniel Patterson. Your Honor, this establishes pattern and practice, Michelle argued. The judge allowed the testimony to continue, though he instructed the jury that it was to be considered only as background context, not as direct evidence of Preston and Victoria's guilt. Randolph Ashford was being tried separately on fraud and embezzlement charges, but his trial had been delayed pending the outcome of the murder case. He sat in the courtroom gallery some days, watching his son and daughter fight for their freedom, his face impassive. Once, during a recess, I found myself face to face with him in the courthouse hallway. For a moment, we just stared at each other, this man who'd built an empire on other people's deaths, and the woman who'd helped bring him down. You think you've won, he said quietly, but you've only delayed the inevitable. The Ashford family has been powerful in this city for 3 generations. We'll survive this. No, I said calmly. You won't. Your hotels are being investigated by the IRS. Your business associates have abandoned you. Your children are going to prison. And everyone knows what you are. You might beat the criminal charges, Mr. Ashford. But your reputation? Your legacy? That's destroyed forever. His hand twitched, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But security was nearby, and he must have realized that assaulting me in a courthouse would only make things worse. He walked away, his shoulders rigid with suppressed rage. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and those were the longest 3 days of my life. I stayed at a hotel near the courthouse, unable to bear the thought of being far away when the verdict came in. Rashid flew in from Dubai to be with me. We sat together in the hotel restaurant, picking at food neither of us wanted, waiting for the call that would tell us the jury had reached a decision. Whatever happens, Rashid said, you've already won in the ways that matter. Diamond Sky is thriving. Daniel's real legacy is secure. You exposed the Ashford family for what they are. Even if Preston and Victoria somehow walk free, they'll never recover from this. I want them in prison, I said. I want them to lose everything, the way I lost Daniel. I know. But sometimes justice doesn't give us everything we want. Sometimes we have to settle for partial victories and trust that the universe will handle the rest. The call came at 2 in the afternoon on the 3rd day. The jury had reached a verdict. We rushed to the courthouse, where a crowd had already gathered. News cameras lined the steps. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat taken, people standing in the back. Preston and Victoria were brought in, both looking haggard and frightened. Carrington stood beside them, his expression carefully neutral. The judge entered, and we all stood. Then he instructed us to sit and asked the jury foreman if they'd reached a verdict. We have, Your Honor. In the case of the state of Colorado versus Preston Ashford, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Preston's face went white. Victoria screamed. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. On the charge of murder for hire. Guilty. More chaos. More banging of the gavel. In the case of the state of Colorado versus Victoria Ashford, on the charge of accessory to murder. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty. Victoria collapsed, sobbing. Preston stood frozen, his face blank with shock. Randolph Ashford stood up in the gallery and tried to push toward his children, but security stopped him. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, and felt Rashid's hand grip mine. This was it. Justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The judge set sentencing for 4 weeks later and remanded both defendants to custody without bail. As Preston and Victoria were led away in handcuffs, Preston finally looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw what I'd been waiting to see all along, the understanding that I had beaten him. That the old woman he'd laughed at had destroyed his entire life. I didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Just met his gaze steadily until he looked away. Outside the courthouse, Michelle Reyes found me in the crowd. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that your evidence made this case. Without your investigation, without your determination to find the truth, Preston and Victoria would have gotten away with murder. You got justice for your son." "Thank you," I said. "For everything." Elizabeth Harris came up beside me. "Mrs. Patterson, can I get a statement?" I looked at the cameras, the reporters, the crowd of people waiting to hear what I'd say. And I thought about Daniel, about what he'd want me to say in this moment. "My son Daniel Patterson was murdered for money," I said clearly. "Today, his killers were held accountable. But this case is about more than one man's death. It's about a family that operated above the law for decades, that destroyed lives for profit, that believed wealth and connections made them untouchable. Today, we proved them wrong. And I hope that gives comfort not just to me, but to every person the Ashford family has ever hurt." I paused, gathering my thoughts. I also want people to know about Daniel's real legacy, Diamond Sky Aviation, a company he built on integrity and excellence. A company that continues to thrive, that employs people from all over the world, that represents everything Daniel believed in. That's what I'll remember. Not how he died, but how he lived and what he built. The questions came fast after that, but I declined to answer, simply walking to the car where Jack waited. As we drove away, I looked back at the courthouse, at the scene of our victory, and felt something shift inside me. For 9 months, I'd been focused entirely on this goal, exposing the Ashford family, getting justice for Daniel. That mission had defined every day, driven every decision. Now it was complete. The Ashford family was destroyed. Daniel's killers were going to prison. So what came next? Who was Helen Patterson now, when she wasn't a woman seeking revenge? The sentencing hearing 4 weeks later was brief and brutal. Preston received 35 years for conspiracy to commit murder and murder for hire. Victoria received 20 years for accessory to murder and conspiracy. Both would be eligible for parole only after serving 85% of their sentences. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, delivered scathing remarks before handing down the sentences. "This court has rarely seen such calculated evil," she said. "You, Mr. Ashford and Mrs. Ashford, conspired to murder a man not out of passion or desperation, but out of pure greed. You wanted his money, his business, his life, and you were willing to kill him to get it. You've shown no remorse, no accountability. You've tried to evade responsibility at every turn. This court hopes that the sentences handed down today will serve as a deterrent to anyone else who might think they can literally get away with murder." Preston and Victoria were both given the chance to speak. Preston declined. Victoria made a rambling statement about how she'd never meant for anyone to die, how she'd only wanted financial security, how Preston had manipulated her. The judge cut her off midway through. "Mrs. Ashford, you had every opportunity to stop this crime. You could have refused to participate. You could have warned your husband. You could have gone to the police. Instead, you actively assisted in his murder. Your crocodile tears do not move this court." Watching them be led away in chains, I felt empty. Not satisfied, not vindicated, just hollow. I'd thought this moment would bring peace, would make Daniel's loss hurt less. But he was still gone. Justice didn't bring him back. Randolph Ashford's trial began 2 months later on the fraud and embezzlement charges. The murder investigation had opened up decades of financial crimes, and prosecutors had built a case that was even stronger than the one against Preston and Victoria. With his children already convicted, Randolph had no one left to protect him. He was found guilty on 12 counts of fraud, 8 counts of embezzlement, and 6 counts of conspiracy. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. He'd be 97 years old before he'd be eligible for parole. Eleanor Ashford, Victoria's mother, had not been charged with any crimes. Prosecutors couldn't prove she'd known about her family's illegal activities. But her social standing in Denver was destroyed. The country club membership was revoked. Former friends stopped taking her calls. The lavish charity balls and society events where she'd once reigned as queen were closed to her now. She sold the family mansion and moved to a modest condo in the suburbs. I saw her once, months later, in a grocery store. She was alone, pushing a cart, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her usual designer clothes. She looked 20 years older than when I'd last seen her. Our eyes met across the produce section. For a moment, I thought she might say something, apologize, curse me, I wasn't sure which. But she just turned away and hurried in the opposite direction, her cart rattling. I felt a pang of something. Not quite pity, but recognition. She'd lost everything too, her husband, her children, her entire life. The difference was, she'd lost it because of her family's choices. I'd lost Daniel because of those same choices. Patterson Aviation filed for bankruptcy in December, almost exactly a year after Daniel's death. The company was liquidated, the planes sold at auction, the airport facility bought by a larger aviation company. The Patterson name disappeared from the Denver business landscape. A few employees from Patterson Aviation reached out to me, asking if there were positions available at Diamond Sky. I referred several of them to Rashid, and he hired the ones who'd been loyal to Daniel, who genuinely cared about him rather than just using him. As for me, I spent Christmas that year in Dubai, at the villa on Palm Jumeirah. Rashid and his family invited me to celebrate with them, and I found myself surrounded by warmth, laughter, the sound of children playing. It wasn't the same as having Daniel there, but it reminded me that life continued, that joy was still possible. On Christmas Eve, I stood on my terrace watching the sunset over the Persian Gulf, and I talked to Daniel. I told him about the trial, about the verdicts, about how Diamond Sky was thriving. I told him I understood now why he'd planned everything the way he had, why he'd left me that plane ticket instead of a traditional inheritance. You knew I needed to discover all this myself, I said to the wind. You knew that if you'd just told me about Diamond Sky, about the Ashford family's crimes, I might not have believed it. Might not have had the strength to fight them. But by making me come to Dubai, by making me learn the business and see what you'd built, you gave me the tools I needed. You gave me power I never would have claimed otherwise. A breeze caught my hair, warm and gentle, and for a moment I could almost feel Daniel there beside me, proud of what I'd accomplished. I miss you every day, I whispered. But I promise I'll take care of your legacy. I promise Diamond Sky will be everything you dreamed it could be. And I promise I'll live the life you wanted for me, not just surviving, but actually living. In January, I officially relocated to Dubai full-time. I sold my house in Denver, the one Daniel had bought me, and used the money to establish a scholarship fund in his name. It would help young people from working-class backgrounds pursue careers in aviation, just like Daniel had done. People who had dreams but not resources. People who reminded me of the boy Daniel had been. I also became deeply involved in Diamond Sky Aviation's operations. Not just as a figurehead owner, but as an active partner. Layla taught me about international finance and regulations. Rashid brought me into strategic planning meetings. I started attending client events, building relationships with the wealthy families and business executives who used our services. And I discovered something surprising: I was good at it. The skills I'd learned raising Daniel on a factory worker's salary, how to stretch resources, how to negotiate, how to read people and understand what they really wanted, translated remarkably well to the business world. I might not have an MBA or decades of corporate experience, but I understood human nature. I understood hard work and integrity and the importance of treating people with dignity. Within 6 months, I'd helped Diamond Sky secure 3 major new clients. Within a year, we'd expanded our fleet to 12 aircraft and opened a second office in Abu Dhabi. The company's value had grown to nearly $60 million. I was 74 years old, and I was running an international aviation empire. Sometimes I'd catch myself in a mirror, this woman in designer clothes, wearing expensive jewelry, making million-dollar decisions, and wonder who she was. She didn't look like Helen Patterson from Denver, factory worker and struggling single mother. But she was. She was all the strength and resilience that Helen had always had, finally given the resources and opportunity to flourish. I made friends in Dubai, other business owners, expatriates from around the world, local families who welcomed me into their circles. I traveled constantly, visiting cities I'd never imagined I'd see: Singapore, London, Paris, Tokyo. Each trip was another piece of the life Daniel had wanted me to have. But I never forgot where I came from. Every year on Daniel's birthday, I flew back to Denver and visited his grave. I'd sit there for hours, telling him about the company, about the people we'd helped, about the life I was living because of his planning and love. And every year on the anniversary of his death, I made a donation to a victims advocacy group in Colorado, helping families who'd lost loved ones to violence seek justice. Because I'd learned that money was a tool, and I could use mine to help others the way Daniel had used his to help me. 2 years after the trial, Elizabeth Harris published a book about the case, Death and Diamonds: How a Mother's Love Brought Down a Criminal Empire. It became a bestseller, spending 14 weeks on the New York Times list. She sent me a copy with an inscription, "For Helen, who taught me that it's never too late to become the hero of your own story." I kept that book on my desk at the Diamond Sky offices, next to the photo of Daniel holding me when he was 5, both of us grinning at the camera. A reminder of where I'd been and how far I'd come. 3 years after Daniel's death, I received a letter from Preston Ashford. It had been forwarded through multiple channels, carefully screened by lawyers before reaching me. The prison system was apparently concerned about inmate-to-victim correspondence. I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won out. The letter was surprisingly articulate, written in careful handwriting on prison stationery. Preston said he'd been in therapy, that he was trying to understand how he'd become the person who'd ordered another man's death. He didn't make excuses or claim innocence, that ship had sailed. But he wrote about the pressure of growing up in the Ashford family, about watching his father destroy business partners and learning that power meant the ability to crush anyone who stood in your way. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I think about Daniel every day. I think about what I took from him, his future, his dreams, his time with you. I think about what I took from you. And I'm sorry. It doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." I read the letter 3 times, trying to decide how I felt. Was this genuine remorse? Or manipulation, an attempt to position himself favorably for a parole hearing decades in the future? In the end, I decided it didn't matter. Whether Preston was truly sorry or not, Daniel was still gone. The apology didn't ease my pain or change what had happened. But I wrote back. Just 3 sentences. "I received your letter. I hope you use your time in prison to become someone different than you were. My son deserved better than what you gave him." I never heard from Preston again. Victoria, on the other hand, sent me letters regularly. Long, rambling, emotional letters claiming she'd never meant for Daniel to die, that she'd loved him in her own way, that Preston had forced her into the conspiracy. She begged me to speak on her behalf at parole hearings, to help her get a reduced sentence, to forgive her. I threw her letters away without reading them after the first 2. Victoria had made her choices. She could live with the consequences. 4 years after Daniel's death, Diamond Sky Aviation was valued at over $100 million. Rashid and I had built something extraordinary, a company known not just for luxury service, but for integrity and excellence. We were regularly featured in aviation industry publications. Business schools used us as a case study in ethical entrepreneurship. And I was wealthy beyond anything I'd ever imagined. My net worth was approximately $75 million, accounting for my share of Diamond Sky and the investments that Daniel had set up for me. But money, I'd learned, was just a tool. It didn't bring happiness by itself. What brought me joy was the work, helping build something meaningful, providing opportunities for others, honoring Daniel's legacy. What brought me peace was knowing that I'd fought for justice and won, that the people who'd killed my son had faced consequences. I dated occasionally. There was a kind widower in Dubai, a businessman from London, a retired pilot who made me laugh. But none of them felt quite right. After 63 years with Daniel as the center of my world, it was hard to imagine sharing my life fully with anyone else. Maybe that would change. Maybe I'd find love again. Or maybe I wouldn't. Either way, I was content. I had purpose, community, financial security, and the knowledge that I'd honored my son's memory in the way he'd asked me to. On what would have been Daniel's 45th birthday, 5 years after his death, I stood on the tarmac at Diamond Sky Aviation's main facility and unveiled our newest aircraft, a state-of-the-art jet that cost $18 million. The plane was painted in Diamond Sky's signature white and gold, with one special addition. Along the fuselage, in elegant script, were the words Daniel's vision. Rashid stood beside me as I cut the ribbon, officially christening the plane. The entire Diamond Sky team was there, along with several major clients and members of the international aviation press. Daniel Patterson believed that aviation was about more than just getting from one place to another, I said in my speech. He believed it was about connecting people, creating opportunities, making the impossible possible. This plane represents those values. Every flight it makes will honor his memory and continue his vision. After the ceremony, Rashid and I took Daniel's vision on its maiden flight, just the 2 of us and the crew, flying from Dubai to Rome for no reason other than we could. We sat in the luxurious cabin, drinking champagne and talking about the business, about life, about how far we'd come. Do you ever regret it? Rashid asked. Coming to Dubai, getting involved in all this? You could have just taken the money and lived quietly somewhere. I thought about that question seriously. No, I said finally. Daniel gave me a gift, not just the money, but the chance to discover who I could be when I wasn't limited by circumstances. He gave me a mission: protect his legacy, seek justice, build something meaningful. Completing that mission gave me purpose after he died. Without it, I think grief would have destroyed me. You've built more than he ever dreamed, Rashid said. Diamond Sky is bigger now than it was when he died. You've taken his vision and expanded it. We've expanded it, I corrected. This is your company too, Rashid. You were Daniel's partner, and you've been mine. I couldn't have done any of this without you. He chose well, Rashid said, raising his glass. In his business partner, and in his mother. We toasted Daniel, high above the Mediterranean, in the plane that bore his name. That's when I realized I'd finally reached something I'd been searching for since that terrible day when the phone rang and destroyed my world: peace. Not the absence of grief. I still missed Daniel every single day, still felt the ache of his absence. But peace in knowing that his death had meaning, that his life had purpose, that his legacy would continue. The Ashford family had taken my son from me, but they hadn't won. Because Daniel had outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave, and I'd completed what he'd started. If you've traveled this journey with me, if you've felt the weight of grief and the satisfaction of justice, then I want you to know, this is why we fight. This is why we refuse to let the people who hurt us win. Not for revenge, though that's part of it, but for meaning. For purpose. For the knowledge that we honored the people we've lost in the best way we knew how. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. Share it if you know someone who needs to hear it. And check the description box below for more stories about survival, justice, and finding strength you never knew you had. 7 years after Daniel's death, I woke up on a Sunday morning in my villa in Dubai and realized I was 70 years old. 70. An age that had once seemed impossibly distant, impossibly old. When I was a young mother working 3 jobs to keep Daniel fed and housed, I hadn't thought much about aging. I'd been too focused on surviving each day. Now here I was, in a villa worth $6 million, running a company worth over $150 million, with a life so different from anything I'd imagined that it sometimes still felt like a dream. I made coffee, using the fancy espresso machine that I'd finally learned to operate, and went out to my terrace. The Persian Gulf glittered in the morning sun, and I could see families on the beach below, children playing in the sand. Life continuing, always continuing, regardless of individual losses. My phone buzzed with a text from Layla. Happy birthday, boss lady. We have a surprise for you at the office tomorrow. I smiled. The Diamond Sky team had become my family in ways that went beyond business. They threw me birthday parties, invited me to their weddings, included me in their lives. Layla had twin daughters now, 3 years old and absolutely fearless. I was Auntie Helen to them, which made my heart swell every time they called me that. Another text, this one from Rashid. 70 is just a number. You have more energy than people half your age. See you at the charity gala tonight. The charity gala. I'd almost forgotten. Tonight was the annual fundraiser for the Daniel Patterson Aviation Scholarship Fund, which had grown into something much larger than I'd originally planned. Over the past 7 years, we'd sent 43 young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to aviation school. 12 of them were now working as pilots, 3 as aircraft mechanics, 2 in aviation management. We were changing lives, creating opportunities, doing exactly what Daniel would have wanted. The gala was being held at the Burj Al Arab, Dubai's most iconic hotel. It would be attended by Diamond Sky's wealthiest clients, by aviation industry leaders from across the Middle East and Europe, by dignitaries and business moguls. And at the center of it all would be me, Helen Patterson, who'd once clipped coupons and worn second-hand clothes, now schmoozing with millionaires and princes. Life was strange. I spent the day quietly, reading on my terrace, going through some business documents, video calling with Mrs. Rodriguez back in Denver. She was in her 80s now, still living in the house next to my old one. I paid for a service to check on her weekly, make sure she had everything she needed. She always protested that she didn't need my charity, but I insisted it wasn't charity, It was gratitude for the years she'd been a good neighbor and friend. That evening, I dressed in a gown that cost more than my first car, midnight blue silk with delicate beading, custom-made by a designer whose name I still couldn't pronounce correctly. I wore the diamond necklace Rashid and Layla had given me for my 65th birthday, and I styled my white hair in an elegant updo that my regular stylist had helped me perfect. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman who commanded respect. A woman who'd built an empire, who'd brought criminals to justice, who'd transformed grief into purpose. But I also saw the tired factory worker who'd raised a son alone. The widow who'd sat in a lawyer's office and thought her child had abandoned her. The grieving mother who'd flown to Dubai not knowing what she'd find. All of those women were me. All of those experiences had shaped who I'd become. The gala was spectacular. The Burj Al Arab's event space was decorated with flowers that must have cost a fortune, with ice sculptures and string quartets and waiters carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The guest list read like a who's who of international wealth and power. Rashid found me shortly after I arrived, looking dapper in a tailored tuxedo. "You look stunning," he said, kissing my cheek. "Ready for your speech?" I'd be giving a keynote address about the scholarship fund, about Daniel's legacy, about the importance of creating opportunities for young people. Public speaking had terrified me when I first started doing it, but I'd learned to push through the fear. I'd learned that my story mattered, that people wanted to hear it. "Ready as I'll ever be," I said. The evening progressed beautifully. Dinner was served, multiple courses of food I couldn't have imagined eating 7 years ago. There was an auction of various luxury items, with proceeds going to the scholarship fund. A private island weekend in the Maldives went for $300,000. A custom-designed watch went for $150,000. People were remarkably generous when they'd had enough champagne and were surrounded by their peers. Then it was time for my speech. I walked to the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, powerful people, wealthy people, people who'd once seemed so far above someone like me. 7 years ago, I began. I was a widow living on Social Security, grieving the loss of my only child. I had no significant savings, no prospects, no idea what the future held. If someone had told me then that I'd be standing here now, in this place, speaking to all of you, I would have thought they were crazy. I paused, letting that sink in. My son Daniel was murdered by people he trusted, people who saw him only as a means to wealth and power. His death could have destroyed me. For a while, I thought it would. But Daniel, in his wisdom, left me more than money. He left me a mission, a purpose, a reason to keep living and fighting. I talked about discovering Diamond Sky Aviation, about learning the truth about the Ashford family, about the trial and the convictions. I talked about transforming grief into action, about using the resources Daniel had given me to honor his memory and help others. The Daniel Patterson Aviation Scholarship Fund represents my son's belief that talent and determination matter more than circumstances, I said. He was a boy from a working-class background who built an aviation empire through hard work, intelligence, and integrity. He wanted others to have the same opportunities he'd fought so hard for. I looked around the room, making eye contact with various guests. Tonight, we've raised over $2 million for the scholarship fund. That money will send approximately 15 more young people to aviation school over the next few years. 15 people who might become pilots, engineers, business people in this industry. 15 people who'll have a chance to transform their lives the way Daniel transformed his. I felt my voice catch, took a breath. I'm 70 years old today. I've lived longer than I ever expected to when I was young and struggling. And I've learned something important. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. It's never too late to find purpose, to fight for justice, to build something meaningful. My son gave me the tools to discover that. And I hope that the young people we help through this scholarship fund will discover it too. The applause was thunderous. People stood, and I stood there at that podium, tears streaming down my face, feeling Daniel's presence so strongly it was almost physical. After the speech, person after person came up to congratulate me, to shake my hand, to tell me how inspiring my story was. A Saudi prince pledged an additional $500,000 to the scholarship fund. A British aviation executive said his company wanted to partner with Diamond Sky on a new venture. A young woman who'd been one of our first scholarship recipients introduced me to her family, telling them I was the reason she'd been able to pursue her dreams. Later, after most of the guests had left, Rashid, Layla, and I sat on the terrace overlooking the Persian Gulf, shoes off, nursing glasses of champagne. You did good tonight, Layla said. Really good. I saw 3 different people crying during your speech. I might have teared up a bit myself, Rashid admitted. And I've heard versions of that speech dozens of times. It never gets easier, I said. Talking about Daniel, about what happened. But it gets more purposeful, if that makes sense. Like each time I tell the story, I'm reinforcing why we do this work. Diamond Sky has expanded beyond anything Daniel imagined, Rashid said. We have 17 aircraft now, offices in 3 countries, partnerships across the region. You've taken his vision and multiplied it. We've multiplied it, I corrected, just like I always did. This is as much yours as mine. True. But you're the heart of it, Helen. You're what makes Diamond Sky more than just another luxury aviation company. Your story, your values, your insistence on doing things the right way, that's what sets us apart. I thought about that. 7 years ago, I'd had no idea how to run a business, no experience in the corporate world, no connections or credentials. But I'd had something more valuable, a lifetime of perseverance, of making hard decisions, of putting in the work even when it was difficult. Those skills, learned through decades of struggle, had turned out to be exactly what I needed. What's next? Layla asked. You've built this amazing company, established the scholarship fund, gotten justice for Daniel. What goals do you still have? It was a good question. I'd been so focused on immediate objectives, building the business, fighting the Ashford family, establishing the scholarship, that I hadn't thought much about long-term dreams. I want to see the company become a model for the entire industry, I said slowly. Not just in terms of luxury and service, but in terms of ethics and sustainability. I want other aviation companies to look at Diamond Sky and see that you can be profitable while also being responsible, while caring about your employees, while giving back to communities. That's a big goal, Rashid said. I have time. And I have you two to help me. I smiled at them. Besides, Daniel taught me to think big. To believe that with the right planning and the right people, anything is possible. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of Dubai reflect off the dark water. Do you think he'd be proud? I asked quietly. Daniel? Of what we've built, of what I've become. Helen, Layla said, taking my hand, he'd be amazed. You took the foundation he built and created something extraordinary. You didn't just preserve his legacy, you expanded it, enhanced it, made it mean more than he probably ever dreamed it could. He loved you so much, Rashid added. Everything he did, all that planning and secrecy and risk, it was for you. To protect you, to provide for you, to give you opportunities. If he could see you now, running Diamond Sky, living this life, helping others, he'd be the proudest man in the world. I wiped away fresh tears. I still miss him every day. Still wonder what he'd say about certain decisions, still want to call him and tell him about something funny that happened. That never goes away, Rashid said gently. But it coexists with the life you're living now. The grief and the joy, they live side by side. He was right. I'd learned that over these 7 years. The missing Daniel hadn't diminished. If anything, some days it felt as sharp and fresh as it had that first terrible week. But alongside that grief, I'd built a life full of meaning, relationships, accomplishments. The pain and the purpose were intertwined, inseparable. The next morning, I went to the Diamond Sky offices to find them decorated with balloons and banners. The entire staff was there, even the people who normally had the day off. They sang happy birthday enthusiastically but off-key, and presented me with a cake shaped like an airplane. We couldn't let your 70th birthday pass without celebrating properly, Layla explained, grinning. There were gifts, thoughtful ones that showed how well my team knew me. A leather-bound journal from the pilots, who knew I liked to write down thoughts and observations. A beautiful scarf from the flight attendants. A framed photograph from the maintenance crew of all 17 Diamond Sky aircraft lined up on the tarmac, with Helen's dream prominently featured in the center. But the gift that made me cry came from the scholarship recipients. They'd pooled their money, not much, because they were students, but it mattered more because of that, and commissioned a portrait of Daniel. It was based on one of my favorite photos of him, taken shortly before his death, showing him smiling in front of one of his planes. We wanted you to have something to remind you that he's still part of Diamond Sky, said Aisha, one of the first scholarship recipients who was now a licensed pilot. That every flight we make, every success we have, it's because of what he built and what you've continued. I hugged her, unable to speak, overcome by the thoughtfulness of it. That portrait now hangs in my office at Diamond Sky, where I see it every day. A reminder of the son I loved, the man I miss, the legacy we're building together even though he's gone. 3 months after my 70th birthday, I received an unexpected call from the FBI. The agent, a woman named Sarah, no, her name was Jennifer Martinez. Wait, no. I needed to avoid those names. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she'd been following the Ashford case since the beginning. Mrs. Patterson, I wanted to give you an update, she said. We've completed our investigation into all 3 of Randolph Ashford's previous business partners' deaths. Based on evidence we've uncovered, we're filing additional murder charges against Randolph. After all this time? I asked. These things take time, especially when the crimes are old and the evidence is circumstantial. But we found enough, witness testimony, financial records, patterns of behavior, to convince a grand jury to indict. Randolph Ashford will face trial for 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and 2 counts of murder for hire. Will you get convictions? We have a strong case. And with his son already convicted of Daniel's murder, the pattern is clear. The Ashford family was essentially a criminal enterprise. I'm confident we'll get justice for those earlier victims. The trials took another 2 years, but Jennifer was right. Randolph was convicted on all counts and received an additional life sentence. He would die in prison, there was no question about that now. I attended the sentencing hearing, the last time I'd ever have to see Randolph Ashford in person. He'd aged dramatically in prison, now looking every one of his 85 years. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he finally spoke. I regret, he said, his voice weak but still carrying that edge of arrogance, that I was caught. Not what I did, but that people like Mrs. Patterson had the resources and determination to expose me. In my day, people like her knew their place. The judge's expression hardened. In every day, Mr. Ashford, murder is murder. Theft is theft. Evil is evil, regardless of who commits it or who exposes it. Your remorse means nothing. Your life is forfeit. Take him away. As Randolph was led out of the courtroom for the last time, he looked at me. And I looked back, feeling none of the satisfaction I'd expected. Just sadness that so many lives had been destroyed, not just the victims, but the Ashford family themselves, twisted by greed and power into something monstrous. Eleanor Ashford died 6 months later, alone in her modest condo. No one attended her funeral except a few distant relatives. The Ashford name, once synonymous with power and wealth in Denver, was now synonymous with murder and corruption. Victoria and Preston remained in prison. I heard occasionally about appeals they'd filed, motions for reduced sentences, claims of injustice. All were denied. They would serve their time, every year of it. I thought sometimes about the different paths lives could take. If Victoria had truly loved Daniel instead of his money, if Preston had built his own success instead of trying to steal someone else's, if Randolph had taught his children about integrity instead of exploitation, how different everything might have been. But they'd made their choices. And I'd made mine. Now, as I prepare to celebrate my 73rd birthday next month, I find myself reflecting on the journey that started with that terrible phone call 7 years ago. I've gone from powerless to powerful, from invisible to visible, from victim to victor. But more importantly, I've gone from broken to whole. Not healed, I don't think you ever fully heal from losing a child. But whole in the sense that I've found meaning in the loss, purpose in the pain, a way forward that honors both who I was and who I've become. Diamond Sky Aviation continues to grow. We're on track to be valued at $200 million within the next year. The scholarship fund has helped 78 young people so far, with plans to double that number in the next 5 years. We've established partnerships with aviation schools across the Middle East, Europe, and Africa, creating pathways for talented people regardless of their backgrounds. And me? I'm still learning, still growing, still discovering what I'm capable of. I've learned 4 languages. I've traveled to 53 countries. I've given keynote speeches at business conferences, been featured in aviation industry publications, been interviewed by journalists who want to understand how a grieving widow became an international businesswoman. But at my core, I'm still the same Helen Patterson who raised Daniel in that small apartment, who worked multiple jobs to keep him fed and housed, who sacrificed everything for his future. That woman's strength didn't come from wealth or status, it came from love, from determination, from refusing to give up even when things seemed impossible. That's the woman I still am. just with better clothes and a nicer address. I keep Daniel's letter in a safe in my villa, taking it out occasionally to read his words again. Trust the plan, he wrote. And I did. I trusted him even when I didn't understand, even when it hurt, even when the path forward seemed impossible to see. That trust was repaid 1,000 times over, not just in wealth, but in purpose, in justice, in the life I've built. If Daniel could see me now, I think he'd laugh at how far his mother has come from that factory floor in Denver. But I also think he'd understand that I didn't become someone different. I just became more fully myself, finally given the resources and opportunities to show what I was always capable of. Before I close this story, I want to tell you one more thing. Last month, Helen's Dream, the plane Daniel had named after me before he died, completed its 1,000th flight. To celebrate, Rashid and I took it on a special journey. We flew from Dubai to Denver, retracing the path I'd taken on that Emirates flight 7 years ago when I'd followed Daniel's final instruction to trust the plan. We visited Daniel's grave, bringing flowers from Dubai, exotic blooms he'd never seen but would have loved. We spent the afternoon there, and I told him everything. About the company's success, about the lives we'd changed through the scholarship fund, about how the people who'd killed him were spending their lives in prison. I kept my promise, I told him. I took care of your legacy. I built something you'd be proud of. And I lived, Danny. I really lived, not just survived. Just like you wanted me to. The wind rustled through the trees, and a cardinal landed on Daniel's headstone, bright red against the grey granite. I'd read somewhere that cardinals are messengers from heaven, signs from loved ones who've passed. I don't know if I believe that. But I liked the idea. After we left the cemetery, Rashid and I flew Helen's Dream back to Dubai, watching the lights of cities pass below us, crossing oceans and continents, literally flying above the world. And I thought about how far I'd come, not just in distance, but in every way that mattered. From grief to purpose. From victim to survivor to victor. From a woman who thought her story was ending to a woman who discovered it was just beginning. So here I am. Helen Patricia Patterson. 73 years old. Co-owner of Diamond Sky Aviation. Mother to a son who changed my life twice, once by being born, and once by how he died. A woman who learned that it's never too late to become powerful, to seek justice, to build a legacy. And if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, through the grief and the rage and the planning and the justice, then thank you. Thank you for witnessing my story. Thank you for understanding why I fought so hard, why I refused to let Daniel's death be meaningless. If you've been betrayed, if you've lost someone you love, if you've ever felt powerless, I want you to know that you're stronger than you think. That sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the catalysts for our greatest transformations. Subscribe if this story touched you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that strength comes in many forms, that justice is possible, that love endures even after death. And check the description box below for more stories about people who refused to be defeated, who fought back, who turned their pain into power. Daniel wanted me to have a better life. He gave me the tools to build it. And every day, I honor his memory by living fully, by building meaningfully, by helping others the way he helped me. That's his real legacy. Not the money, not the company, not even the justice we got against the people who killed him. His real legacy is the proof that love, true, selfless, enduring love, never dies. It just transforms, finding new ways to nurture and protect and guide us, even from beyond the grave. And that, my friends, is the greatest inheritance anyone could ever receive. Check the description box below for more stories like this, stories of loss and revenge, betrayal and justice, grief and rebirth. Stories about ordinary people who became extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. Because we all have that capacity inside us. We just need the right catalyst to bring it out. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for witnessing what became of Helen Patterson, the woman who was handed a plane ticket instead of an inheritance, and who discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages.